Under the late morning heat, the town shimmered through rising dust. A crowd tightened around the raised platform before the land office, not the loose noise of horse trading, but a compressed silence, as if the whole street had agreed not to breathe. On the boards, two figures stood tall. Iron chains hung heavy on their wrists. The one in front held her spine like carved stone, eyes scanning the faces below without a flicker of fear. Behind her, the younger one's breathing came shallow and uneven, one side of her body carefully still. The auctioneer's hammer rose. Numbers climbed. Whispers died. A voice cut through from the edge of the crowd. 500. No one countered. The hammer began to fall. The road into Marrow Creek was the same road it had always been, dust. Ruts worn deep by wagon wheels that never seemed to learn a new path. The smell of horse sweat and dry earth, and underneath that, something faintly rotten baking slow in the late morning heat. Grier Calloway knew every bend of it. Had ridden it so many times his horse took the turns before he pulled the reins, which meant his hands were free, which meant there was nothing left to do but think. He did not like thinking. Not anymore. Because thinking had a way of sliding sideways, into places he'd sealed off years back and nailed shut and told himself were fine. The ranch, the debts, the short list of things he had, and the longer list of things he didn't, all of it manageable, all of it under control. Except the other thing. The thing that woke him at 3 in the morning with his heart slamming against his ribs and his hand reaching across a bed that had been empty for 5 years. He looked down at his left hand. The ring sat where it always sat, plain silver, worn smooth on the inner edge from years of turning it without noticing he was doing it. Addie had saved 4 months of egg money to buy that ring, had set it on the kitchen table like she was closing the most serious business deal of her life, which he'd come to understand she was. She'd counted out the coins in front of him one at a time like she wanted him to see every cent of it, like the counting itself was part of the gift. He remembered laughing at her for it, gentle, the way you laugh at someone you love doing something entirely unnecessary and entirely her. She hadn't laughed back, had just looked up at him, serious as a church, and said, "This one's not for show, Grier Calloway. This one's for keeping." He looked at the ring for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at the road. 3 things on his mind today. Buy the cattle. Pay down what he owed the feed store. Get back before dark. Simple. Clean. The kind of plan a man makes when he's stopped expecting anything from a day except getting through it. He did not plan for what came next. Nobody plans for the thing that changes them. That's the trick of it. It just walks up while you're thinking about egg money and cattle prices, and it doesn't ask permission. There had been a version of this road once that he'd ridden with other people on it. His father up ahead on the gray gelding, always half a length in front, out of some stubborn habit he'd never explained. His mother beside him with a basket of eggs balanced against her hip like weighed nothing. Wren, younger, arguing with him about something that had felt enormous at the time, and that he could no longer, for the life of him, remember the substance of. Just the sound of her voice doing it. Bright and unbothered and certain she was right. He didn't let himself go down that road often. It cost too much and gave back too little most days. But it was there anyway, running alongside the real road like a shadow the sun couldn't quite burn off. And some mornings, this one included, he could feel it pressing up against the present, the way a bruise presses up against a shirt sleeve. Not painful exactly, just there, reminding him. Marrow Creek came up through the heat shimmer the way it always did, half real, tilting slightly, like a town that had only loosely agreed to stand in one direction and call it a street. The feed store, the assay office, the hotel that turned into a gambling hall after 9 and didn't bother pretending otherwise. And today, apparently, something happening on the main street that had pulled half the town into a knot around the land office steps. He passed the mercantile first. Garrison Voss stood in the doorway, watching the crowd with an expression that wasn't hostile, wasn't welcoming either. Just the particular, careful attention of a man cataloging a situation and calculating what it meant for him. Grier didn't know Voss well. Ran the biggest supply operation in 3 counties. Friendly, in the way that a man's friendliness is sometimes just the most efficient tool he owns. Voss caught his eye, nodded, easy as anything. Grier nodded back, kept walking. He heard the crowd before he saw what it was gathered around, and that was the first wrong note. Because crowd noise in a town like this had a sound to it, And this wasn't that sound. Not the loose, easy noise of men trading horses or arguing prices. Tighter than that. Compressed. The sound of people watching something they had complicated feelings about, and had agreed, without saying so, not to look at too closely. He tied his horse at the feed store rail. Told himself he was just passing through. He was not just passing through. The auction platform sat raised above the crowd, a stretch of boardwalk in front of the land office, 3 steps up, maybe 20 feet across. A man with a ledger and a rolling, practiced voice stood off to one side, working numbers into that smooth cadence that made everything sound fair even when it wasn't. And on the platform, 2 women. Grier registered them in pieces, because that was the only way his mind seemed able to process it. Tall, both of them, extraordinarily tall. The kind of height that didn't announce itself, just existed. Calm. Absolute. The way a mountain exists. The one standing in front was maybe late 20s. Dark hair pulled back tight, cheekbones like carved stone. He could see it in the bearing of her, a stillness that wasn't passivity. Something older than that. Iron chains sat on her wrists, and she watched the crowd the way a general studies a field before the fighting starts. Not with fear, with assessment. Behind her slightly stood the younger one. Same height, 19, maybe 20. Softer in the face, but eyes missed nothing, and her breathing, he clocked it without meaning to. The way you clock a limping horse, her breathing was wrong. Shallow on one side. Something hurt. Something had been hurting a while. Grier stood at the edge of the crowd and could not make his legs carry him away. He should have. Every practical bone in his body was telling him to. Buy the cattle. Pay the feed store. Get back before dark. That had been the whole of it. That morning, the entire architecture of his day, and none of it had left room for standing in the dust of Marrow Creek, watching 2 strangers get sold like a matched pair of plow horses. Except he couldn't make his boots agree with the rest of him. Because there was something in the way the younger one stood chin up, jaw tight, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her flinch that reminded him of somebody. He couldn't place it at first. Just a feeling, low and persistent, like a name sitting on the tip of his tongue, until the older one moved her hands. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that undid 5 years of careful, deliberate numbness in about half a second flat. The auctioneer's voice rolled over the noise. Numbers climbing. Men calling bids the way they'd call a price on a heifer. A rancher near Grier said something that made his neighbor laugh. Grier didn't hear what. He was watching the taller woman's hands. Because even in chains, even standing on a platform in the middle of Marrow Creek, with 30 men treating her like livestock, she moved her wrists just slightly and placed her chained hands in front of the younger woman. A small thing. Almost nothing. His sister used to do that. Wren. When they were kids and something frightened him, because she was braver, because she was older, because that was simply what you did. Wren had been 23 when she died. He hadn't let himself think her name straight through in longer than he could say. It arrived now anyway, uninvited, the way it always did, not as grief exactly, more like a hand pressed flat against his chest, steady, reminding him it was still there. The hammer was rising. Grier's mouth opened before his mind caught up to it. 500. The words came out of him like a stone out of a sling. No hesitation. No thought behind it at all. Just pure, clean, completely insane. The crowd turned. The auctioneer blinked. Even the taller woman, the one who hadn't reacted to a single thing on that platform, turned her head and looked at him. Grier stood there in the dust with $347 in his coat pocket, and an expression on his face that felt exactly as idiotic as it looked. Going once, said the auctioneer, recovering fast. Nobody countered. Going twice. The man who'd been bidding before him, heavy-set, expensive hat, the particular red face of someone used to getting what he wanted, stared at Grier like he'd like to know what was wrong with him. Didn't raise the bid. Either the price had already found his ceiling, or something on Grier's face told him he didn't want to know what he'd be buying into. Sold. The hammer came down like a period at the end of a sentence that had been building for a long, long time. The crowd didn't disperse right away. That was the part nobody warns you about the after. A ring of faces, some curious, some approving in a way that made Grier's stomach turn, a few outright disgusted, though whether at him or at the auction itself, he genuinely could not have said. A woman near the front pulled her shawl tighter and said something to the woman beside her, low, and both of them, looked at Greer like he'd tracked something unpleasant into a church. An old man near the rail spat into the dust. "Fool's errand," he said, to nobody in particular, loud enough to make sure Greer heard it anyway. "Feeding two of them through winter. See how charitable he feels come January." Greer didn't answer him. Didn't have an answer. Not yet, not one that would have satisfied either of them. A hand landed on his shoulder before he'd gone 3 steps. Ezra Dunmore ran the spread 2 ridges over. A decent enough man, in the ordinary run of things, face pulled tight with something that might have been concern, and might just as easily have been embarrassment on Greer's behalf. "Son," Dunmore said, low like he was trying to keep it between the two of them and not entirely succeeding. "What in God's name did you just do?" "Bought their freedom. You bought a debt you can't pay, and a problem this town's going to hand you back tenfold." Dunmore glanced toward the platform, toward Yen and Ituha still standing there in their chains, waiting on whatever came next. "I've known you since you were knee-high to your daddy. I liked your daddy. I'm asking you as a friend, think about what you're walking into before you walk any further into it." "I have thought about it," Greer said, which wasn't entirely true, but felt true enough in the moment that he didn't feel the lie of it. Dunmore studied him a beat longer, then shook his head, not unkind, and let his hand fall away. "Your business," he said. "Always was." He turned and went back into the crowd, and Greer watched him go and felt the first small, cold understanding that today was going to cost him more than $153, and that most of what it cost wasn't going to show up on any ledger he knew how to keep. He stood outside the land office and did the arithmetic. $347 in his pocket. $500 what he'd just said, out loud, in front of witnesses. Which left a gap, a $153 gap, and no way around it. He walked the length of the main street to the pawnbroker's shop, the one with the dusty window and the sign that had bleached itself into near illegibility over the years. He'd passed it 100 times. Had always felt, in that quiet, private way of a man who's never needed something, a little contempt for it. He walked in now. The man behind the counter looked at him the way pawnbrokers look at everyone, with the specific practiced sympathy of a man who has seen this exact situation more times than he could count, and made his peace with profiting from it. Greer took the ring off his left hand. He didn't let himself think about it. He'd learned that, about certain things, you don't think about them. You just do them, the way you cross cold water fast, without stopping, without looking down. Plain silver, worn smooth on the inner edge. 4 months of egg money. He set it on the counter. The pawnbroker turned it over once between his fingers, held it up to the light coming through the dusty window, and named a number. Greer said nothing. Took the money. Walked out. Didn't look back at the window. The sun outside was too bright. It was always too bright on days like this, he thought. As if the world hadn't gotten the message that something had just cracked open. The paperwork took 20 minutes. He signed where they pointed. The clerk walked him through the terms, with the careful, flat efficiency of a man who did this every week, and had built a tone around it that suggested it was ordinary. "You'll want to record their names for the county file," the clerk said, pen hovering, bored past the point of caring what the answer was. "They've got names." "Course they do." The clerk didn't look up. "I mean names for the file. Something that'll write down clean." "Write down what they tell you," Greer said. "That's the name." The clerk glanced up at that, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been mild surprise, might have been the faint, weary recognition of a man who processes the same small cruelty often enough to stop noticing it's a cruelty at all, until someone declines to let him commit it quite so easily. "Suit yourself," he said, and wrote it down anyway, the long way, without further comment. For him, Greer supposed, it probably was ordinary, the whole grim machinery of the thing, reduced to a line in a ledger and a signature and a fee. That was, Greer thought, walking back out into the sun, maybe the worst part of all of it. Not the cruelty itself, but how thoroughly the town had learned to file it away as paperwork. He took the bill of sale and walked back to the platform. The 2 women were still standing where they'd been. The crowd had mostly scattered, though a few men lingered at a distance, with that particular quality of attention Greer had come to recognize as men waiting to see something go wrong. He stopped in front of them. Up close, the height was something he had to recalibrate to. He wasn't a short man, but he was looking up, and the older one was looking down at him with an expression that told him absolutely nothing. Not fear, not gratitude, not curiosity. Just assessment. He reached into his coat, took out the key the clerk had handed him, held it up so she could see it. I'm going to take these off. A pause. And then you're free to go wherever you want. She watched him. He unlocked the chain at her wrists. The metal fell away. She didn't rub her wrists. Didn't react at all. Just watched him move to the younger woman and do the same. The chains hit the boardwalk with a sound like an argument ending. By the law of your people, the older woman said. Her English was precise, careful. The English of someone who'd learned it from people who spoke it formally and had kept it that way on purpose. We belong to you now. That's not how I see it, Grier said. Then explain how you see it. He thought about it, which he genuinely hadn't done, not really, at any point up until that exact moment. I paid to take the chains off, he said. That's all. Where you go from here is your business. A silence. Then the younger woman spoke. Her voice was quieter, but the question underneath it wasn't quiet at all. Go where? Grier opened his mouth. Closed it. Our village was attacked 4 months ago, the older woman said, in that same measured English. Our people are scattered. The cavalry is looking for us. We are not welcome in towns like this one. She looked around Marrow Creek with an expression of calm, precise disdain. You gave us but freedom. Freedom to do what? Exactly? He hadn't thought about this part. He should have thought about this part. He was, quite obviously, not thought about this part. So he told them about the ranch. Told it badly at first, stumbling over the parts where he tried to make it sound like more than it was, and then gave up and just described it plain. One main building. A barn that leaned east. 30 head of cattle on a good day. A creek that ran clear year-round in the north corner of the property. It's nothing impressive, he said. But there's a roof, and there's food, and there's work if you want it. Not charity. A partnership. You help with the ranch, I provide the roof, while you figure out what's next. The older woman studied him the way she'd been studying him since he unlocked the chains. Like a surveyor reading unfamiliar terrain. Mapping every feature. Noting every fault line. You would trust 2 Apache women in your home, she said. Your people have been taught that we are dangerous. My people have taught me plenty of things that turned out to be wrong. He paused. Besides, you've had 3 chances to walk away since I took those chains off, and you're still standing here talking to me. He shrugged. That tells me something. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. I am Yen, she said. My sister is a Tuha. Grier Calloway. You are a man who acts before he thinks. Usually works out. Not always, she said, and held his gaze steady enough that he understood she wasn't just making conversation. He bought provisions at the general store, and that was where the day showed him its second face. The store owner watched the 3 of them come through the door, with an expression that had several components, none of them welcoming. He rang up the flour and the salt and the dried beans without a word, and when Grier reached for the tin of coffee that cost more than it should have, the man's eyes flicked, deliberate, toward Yen and Ituha standing near the window. They'll be needing their own provisions. I take it, the store owner said. Separate from yours. They'll be eating what I eat, Grier said. Same table. That's your business. The man's mouth had gone thin. Won't be everyone's out this way, you understand that. I understand it fine. He paid. Didn't make conversation. Loaded the wagon. And didn't look back at the window the way he hadn't looked back at the pawnbrokers, because he was starting to suspect that not looking back was going to become something of a habit for him, this particular day. The ride back took the better part of 2 hours. Nobody talked much. The land rolled past on either side scrub brush, red rock formations, the occasional stand of cottonwood marking underground water. The sky had gone the color of hammered copper at the edges, flat white overhead. Grier sat up front holding the reins and tried very hard to think about the feed store debt. Behind him, he could hear the 2 women speaking low, in their own language, not hiding it, not performing it either, just talking. The rhythm of it was unlike anything he'd heard water moving over rock at different depths. He didn't try to understand it, he kept his eyes on the road. About 40 minutes out, he heard a sound that wasn't right. A breath caught, cut short. He turned without thinking. Ituha's jaw was set hard. Her right hand pressed flat against her left side, and she was staring at a fixed point on the horizon, with the particular intensity of someone who has decided that if they look hard enough at one thing, the pain won't win. You're hurt, Grier said. She didn't look at him. It's nothing. That's not nothing. He'd grown up around livestock, around ranch work, around the specific injuries both produced. He knew the way a person held themselves around a broken rib, the shallow breathing, the careful stillness. How long? Itua said nothing. Yen answered for her, flat and informational. The way you talk about something when the feeling underneath it is too big to carry in a normal voice since we were taken. Fight. She fell from a horse during the fight. She has not had proper care. Greer looked at the road ahead. Did the math. They were closer to the ranch than back to town. He thought for one brief second about the Marrow Creek doctor, a narrow, unpleasant man named Feasley who'd made his feelings about Apache patients plain enough twice in Greer's hearing that nobody in 3 counties would have mistaken it for anything but policy. Greer had watched him turn a man away from his own door once, an old rancher's hired hand, purely for the color of his skin and the shape of his cheekbones, and had told himself at the time it wasn't his business to interfere. It was his business now. I know how to wrap ribs, he said. Not a doctor, but I know what I'm doing. My mother was a midwife before she married my father. Taught me field medicine, because out on a ranch there's no time to wait on someone with a diploma. And there's a doctor in Marrow Creek who wouldn't touch you if you were bleeding out on his own porch step. So we're not wasting daylight riding back to ask him. Yen watched him. You would do this, she said. Not quite a question. I would do this. Another of those long measuring pauses he was beginning to understand was simply how she processed things. Thoroughly, without rushing. All right, she said. The ranch came into view around the last bend of the creek road. Nothing impressive, exactly as he'd described it. The main cabin sat sheltered by 3 red rock walls on the north and east sides, which kept the worst of the winter wind off. The barn leaned. The corral held 7 horses and looked like it was conserving effort just to stand there. But the creek ran clear in the north corner, and the cottonwoods lined the water, and in the late afternoon light, with the rock faces going orange and amber, and the shadows stretching long across the yard, it had a quality to it Greer had stopped noticing years ago. He noticed it now. Seeing it, for a moment through 2 sets of unfamiliar eyes, Yen looked at the water first. That creek, it runs all year? Most years. Fed by springs in the rock. She said something to Ituha in their own language. Ituha answered short. Something about the direction of the water, Greer guessed, though he couldn't say for certain. Your father chose well, Yen said. He chose this land before I was born. Said the water was worth more than anything you could build. He was right. Greer climbed down from the wagon. Barn has a loft if you want more privacy. Cabin's got 2 rooms. I'll take the back one. You can have the front or the loft, whichever suits you better. Ituha descended with a careful, guarded stiffness. Yen came down with a fluid, unhurried movement that was, if Greer was honest with himself, mildly disconcerting, like watching something built for open country adapt itself in real time to new terrain. The loft, Yenna said. Higher ground. Better sight lines. He nodded, like that was a completely normal reason to choose where you slept, because apparently, out here it was. He helped Ituha down carefully. She let him, which told him more about how much pain she was in than anything she'd said out loud. Inside the cabin, he cleared the table, brought out clean cloth, the small tin of rendered tallow that served as salve, the roll of cotton bandage his mother had insisted he keep stocked, and that he'd been mildly annoyed about maintaining for years, right up until the first time he needed it. He remembered her teaching him. 14 years old, holding a strip of cloth wrong, and his mother's hands closing over his to correct the angle without a word of scolding in it. You don't rush a wrap, Greer. A rushed wrap does the body more harm than the injury did. He hadn't thought about her hands in years. They came back to him now, clear as the creek outside, guiding his own. Ituha sat in the wooden chair by the table. Yen stood near the door, arms loose, watching. This will hurt, Greer said. Not an apology, just information. I know, said Ituha. He worked carefully, efficiently, the way his mother had taught him, matter of fact, without drama, with a deep and quiet attention to doing the thing correctly. 3 ribs on the left side, maybe 4. One possibly cracked clean through. The bruising had gone yellow at the edges, which told him this had gone untreated for at least 3 weeks. He didn't say anything about that, just rapped. Ituha breathed through it, made no sound, but at one point her hand gripped the edge of the table, hard enough her knuckles went pale, and he registered it and adjusted the angle of his hands without comment. When he finished, he stepped back. Itua took a slow, experimental breath, then another, and the careful, braced quality of her posture shifted not completely, but enough that he saw it, like a door unlocking. She looked at him. First time she'd looked at him directly. "You have done this before. Ranch work," he said. "You learn medicine, or you don't survive out here." He started cleaning up the materials. Yen hadn't moved from her spot by the door, but she was watching him with that same topographical attention, filing every detail, every decision he made or didn't make. "There's food in the cabinet," he said. "Take whatever you need. I'll see to the horses and check the cattle before dark." He picked up his hat, moved toward the door. "Grier Calloway." He stopped. Yen's voice. He turned. She was looking at him steadily. "The attack 5 years ago," she said. "Tell me what happened." He hadn't spoken about it in close to 2 years. Hadn't planned on speaking about it tonight or possibly ever again. But something in the directness of the question, not prying, not sympathetic in that hollow way people sometimes were, just direct, requesting information. It made him answer. He sat down, told it plainly, the way it happened. He'd been in town that day, selling 3 head at market, rode back in the late afternoon and saw smoke from 3 miles out. The ranch had been hit from the south and east at the same time. His father and mother in the main cabin, his sister in the barn. He described the direction of the attack, the time of day, the way the horses had all been taken, every one of them, and the pattern of movement he'd been able to read across the property afterward, in the tracks. Yen listened, went very still while she listened. When he finished, she didn't speak right away, looked at the floor, then at him. "Describe the movement of the men who did it," she said. "How did they come onto the property?" He described it. The approach from an arroyo to the south. The way the tracks had moved. 2 groups, coordinated, one drawing attention east while the other hit the cabin. A silence. Different from the one before. Heavier. "My people do not attack from arroyos in the late afternoon," Yensa said quietly. "The sun sits directly in our eyes from the south at that hour. We do not use that approach. We isolate a structure and enter it. We do not strike 2 at once, and we do not take every horse on a property that creates noise and slows the retreat. It is a mistake a raiding party of my people does not make." She held his gaze. "I am not asking you to believe me. I am telling you what I know about how my people move and how they do not. What you do with that is your own choice." Grier looked at her. Something cold moved through him. Not anger. Something quieter than anger. The particular sensation of a thing you've believed absolutely for 5 years, beginning to shift underneath you. "Then who?" "I don't know," said Yen. "But I know what it was not. And a man who wants to be believed as one thing often makes very sure to leave behind exactly what people expect to find." He sat with it. The lamplight moved. One of the horses stamped outside in the corral. He stood, put his hat back on, walked to the door, and stopped with his hand on the frame. "Coffee's in the tin on the stove," he said. "Kindlings by the hearth if the fire goes low." He walked out. The night air was cold and very clear, stars beginning to show themselves in the dark blue above the rock walls. He stood in the yard a moment, then went to see to the horses, because that was a thing he knew how to do with his hands, and right now his hands were the only part of him that felt reliable. He did not sleep well. Not because of the strange presence in the house that, oddly, hadn't felt as strange as he'd expected. It was the small sounds, the murmur of voices from the loft, the different quality of not alone, which had a weight to it he hadn't planned for. He lay on his cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about arroyos and afternoon sun angles and the way tracks had lain across his property 5 years ago. He had believed, without questioning it, that it was Apache raiders. Because that was what people said. Because that was the explanation he'd been handed while he had absolutely no capacity to question anything at all. And he had carried it. This hard, angular piece of certainty had built a fair amount of his grief around it, like scaffolding. And Yen hadn't asked him to believe anything, hadn't argued, had simply laid out a set of observations about how her people moved and how they didn't, and left him alone in the dark with it, which was, somehow, worse than an argument would have been. He fell asleep sometime around midnight, dreamed about Wren standing in front of him with her arms out, the way she had the last time he'd seen her alive, laughing at something he could no longer remember the shape of. The barn loft was quiet before dawn. Then it wasn't the creak of old wood moving overhead, and Yen came down the ladder with the same fluid ease she seemed to bring to everything. Grier looked up and had to remind himself that this, apparently, was just what mornings were going to look like now. She had braided her hair, worked something into it, small items, beads or feathers. He couldn't see clearly in the low light. On her cheekbone sat two marks in some dark pigment. Geometric. Precise. He would understand later that they meant something about who she was, where she came from, who had come before her. In the middle of everything, captivity, chains, being carried off from everything she knew, she had put them back on as the first act of the morning. He found he had nothing to say about that. That wasn't inadequate. So he said, "Coffee's on." She looked past him, at the corral, at the horses. "You've lost cattle recently," she said. Not a question. He glanced over 2, maybe 3. Past month. She walked to the edge of the corral, crouched, looked at the ground near the water trough, examined the tracks the way he'd seen trackers work, not fast, not dramatic, but slow and patient, like the ground was a document and she was reading it line by line. Then she stopped, reached down, picked something out of the dirt near the base of the trough post, small enough that Grier hadn't seen it at all, standing over the same ground not 2 feet away. She held it up, a short length of twine, waxed, the kind used to bind grain sacks, stamped into the leather tag knotted at its end, faint but legible if you knew to look, were 3-0. Grier's stomach went cold. "Feed sacks," he said slowly. "That's from a feed sack. Voss's Mercantile stamps their tags like that." "Someone tied something with this," Yen said, "recently. The twine hasn't weathered the way the rest of the ground has. And it was here, at the trough, where a man would stand if he were counting cattle in the dark, close enough to see, far enough to run if a dog started barking. You think Voss took my cattle? I think someone working for him did. Or someone who buys his feed and doesn't mind leaving a trace of it behind, because he never expected anyone to look this closely at the ground beneath his own boots." She turned the twine over once in her fingers before handing it to him. "A man who has never had to explain himself grows careless about what he leaves lying around." Grier looked at the little scrap of waxed string sitting in his palm like it weighed considerably more than it should have. "Show me where else," he said. They walked the fence line together, slow, Yen's eyes on the ground the whole way, reading it the way another man might read a letter. Twice more she stopped. Once at a place where the grass had been flattened in a pattern too wide and too regular to be deer. Once near the tree line where a man had clearly stood a while, long enough to leave a heel mark pressed deep and dry into the softer dirt beneath the cottonwoods, facing back toward the house. "Watching," Grier said. "Counting," Yen corrected. "There is a difference. A man watching is curious. A man counting is planning something, and has decided the counting is worth the risk of being seen doing it." She crouched by the heel mark, studied the depth of it. "He stood here more than once. The mark is layered, one older print beneath a fresher one. Same boot, same stance." She looked up at Grier. "Someone has been coming back." "How long?" "Weeks. Longer, maybe, before we ever arrived here." She stood, brushed the dust from her knees. "This was not started because of us, Grier Calloway. We only walked into the middle of something that was already moving." He stood there a long moment, looking at the tree line, at the ridge beyond it, feeling the shape of his own ranch rearrange itself in his mind, from a place he knew by heart into a place someone else had apparently been studying, quietly, patiently, for longer than he wanted to think about. "Ituha," he said. "How is she this morning?" "The breathing is better." A pause. He nodded, started for the cabin, the twine still folded into his fist. "Come eat," he said. "We've got a lot to figure out." She fell into step beside him, and if anyone had been watching from the ridge to the north, and as it happened, someone was, they'd have seen a lean rancher and a tall Apache woman crossing a yard in early light, talking with the easy, practical tone of two people who had decided, without quite saying it out loud, that there might be something worth building here. 3 weeks. That's all it took for the ranch to start looking like something other than a man slowly losing an argument with the land. The north fence, the one that had been leaning since March, the one Grier had been meaning to fix since March, the one he'd looked at every single morning since March and thought tomorrow got fixed on day 4. He came out with the post driver and found Ituha already working, moving with a methodical efficiency that made the job look easy, which it was not. She didn't look up. "You were going to use that wrong anyway," she said. He put the post driver down, went and got the wire stretcher instead. They fixed the fence together in silence, and somewhere in that silence, without anybody announcing it, the working arrangement became something else. Not friendship yet, not exactly, but the particular, functional closeness of two people who've discovered their separate skills fit together like two halves of one task, which in its own quiet way was a remarkable thing. You heal fast, Greer said, one morning, watching her carry a full water pail. Without so much as a flinch, Ituha looked at him with those watchful eyes. Or your idea of how long healing takes is built on men who don't pay attention to their own bodies. He thought about that. Fair. You held your left shoulder wrong for the first 2 days I was here, she added, not looking up from the pail. You favor it when you're tired. An old injury. Broke it falling off a roof. 6 years back. It still tells the truth about the weather before it happens. It does, he admitted, surprised. How'd you know that? Because you rubbed it yesterday morning, before the clouds came in. She shrugged. The barest movement, I told you. I pay attention. One evening, mending a bridle by lamplight, she caught him squinting at the tiny stitches on a cinch strap and without a word, took it out of his hands and finished the row herself in a third of the time it would have taken him, the needle moving in a fast, sure rhythm that made his own attempts look, in retrospect, like the work of a much younger and much clumsier man. Teach me that, he said. She looked at him like he'd asked something faintly ridiculous. It is only patience. Then teach me patience. That got something out of her, not quite a laugh, but a breath of air through the nose that was clearly its cousin. She handed the needle back, guided his fingers through the first stitch, corrected the tension, with 2 fingers pressed light against the back of his hand. Slower, she said. You are still moving like a man who thinks the work will run away from him. Won't it? No, Ituha said. The work has nowhere else to be. Only you do. She watched him try again, wince at his own crookedness, try a third time. Better, she allowed, which from her, he was beginning to understand, counted as high praise. He learned, over that week, that she took her coffee black and disapproved openly of how weak he made it, that she had a low, private laugh she almost never let out in full, like she'd trained herself somewhere along the way to keep even her amusement quiet, that she asked him, one afternoon out of nowhere, whether he had any books in the cabin, and when he admitted to owning exactly 3: a Bible, an almanac, and a battered novel his mother had loved, she asked to borrow the novel, and returned it 4 days later, having read it twice, with opinions about the ending that she delivered with the same flat, unhurried precision she brought to everything else. The man in the story, she said, makes the wrong choice at the end. He chooses the easier grief instead of the harder truth. Most people do, Grier said. Most people are wrong to. She handed the book back. I would have written it differently. Maybe you should. She looked at him for a long moment, like she was actually considering it, and said nothing at all, which he was starting to understand was, with the Tuha, very often its own kind of answer. By the end of the second week, she was doing full work careful, still guarding the left side on certain movements, but full work. Took over the tack and equipment with a precision that made Grier a little embarrassed about the state he'd let things slide into. Saddles re-soaped. Bridles reconditioned. The rifle he'd been meaning to clean since before winter, cleaned properly, in a way that suggested she had opinions about his prior maintenance habits and had decided the kindest thing was simply to fix it without saying anything. He appreciated the restraint. In the evenings, he showed them the ledger feed costs, market prices, the particular arithmetic of a small operation running on margins thin enough to read a newspaper through. Yen listened to all of it, then said, the man who buys your cattle at market. Hendricks. He is paying 8% below fair price. Grier looked at the numbers. He'd never once compared them to the regional rate. How do you know the regional rate? I listened, said Yen, at the market, while you were signing paperwork. Men talk freely when they don't think anyone important is listening. She didn't say what she meant by important. Didn't need to. You could have mentioned that before I signed with Hendricks again last month, Greer said, mock-wounded. You did not ask. I wasn't aware I needed to ask my house guests to audit my cattle sales. You do, Yen said. Entirely serious, if your house guests are better at arithmetic than the man you have been trusting with it. A pause, and something that might have been the ghost of dry humor moved behind her eyes. I am not saying this to wound you, Grier Calloway. I am saying it because it is true, and because you are the sort of man who would rather hear an unpleasant truth than a comfortable lie. I have been watching you 3 weeks. I am fairly certain of this by now. That obvious. You unlocked chains on strangers because a hammer was about to fall, she said. That is not a man built for comfortable lies. She tried, one afternoon that second week, to teach him to move through the scrub brush without announcing himself to every living thing within a quarter-mile. It did not go well. You walk like the ground owes you an apology, Yen told him. After his third attempt sent a jackrabbit bolting from cover 30 feet before he'd even gotten close. Heel first. Every time. It is a habit built for boardwalks, not for country that wants to hear you coming. I've walked this land my whole life. You have walked on top of it your whole life. That is different from moving through it. She demonstrated once, slow enough for him to study it, weight rolling forward from the ball of the foot. No wasted motion, no sound at all beyond the barest whisper of grass. Try again. He tried again. Sent up a covey of quail this time, which at least represented some kind of variety in failure. Yen watched them scatter with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd met her, unmistakably amused. Perhaps, she said, you will simply have to be very charming instead. Some men are given feet. Others are given other gifts. That's supposed to be a compliment? It is supposed to be encouragement, she said. I am told encouragement works better on some men than honesty. Try honesty. I can take it. Honesty, she said, is that you walk like a man who has never once in his life needed to be quiet, because nothing has ever hunted him. A pause, and something in her face shifted, softened at the edges. That is not a criticism, Grier Calloway. In my life, it would be called good fortune. He didn't have an answer for that one. Just nodded and went back to practicing. Heel lifted, weight rolling forward, and got marginally better at it before the light gave out. Another evening, mending harness by the fire, Ituha taught him a word, just one, offered without ceremony, the way she offered most things that mattered to her. Say it back, she said after. He mangled it, badly enough that Yen, over by the window, made a sound that might have been a laugh disguised as a cough. Again, Ituha said, patient as stone. He tried again. Got closer. She nodded once, satisfied enough to let it stand. What's it mean? Water that does not stop, she said. Or the closest I can carry it into your language. Some words do not cross over whole. They lose pieces on the way. She glanced toward the creek, audible faintly through the open door. My mother used it for the creek behind our old village. I have not said it out loud in some time. Why now? Itua considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she gave everything. Because there is a creek here that reminded me of it, she said finally. And because you asked to be taught patience, and this seemed a smaller, easier thing to hand you first. He turned the word over once more in his mouth. Careful with it now. The way you're careful with something borrowed and precious, and not quite yours to keep. It didn't come out right. It came out close enough that Ituha allowed herself, for just a moment, something that was unmistakably a smile. It was over supper, a few nights later, beans and cornbread that had come out slightly uneven, because Grier was a competent but uninspired cook, and had never claimed otherwise, that the three of them settled into something that felt, for the first time, less like an arrangement and more like a household. Your sister, Ituha said, apropos of nothing, the way she asked most of her hardest questions. You dream about her. You say her name in your sleep sometimes. I have heard it from the loft. Grier set his fork down. Wren, he said. She'd have been 28 this spring. What was she like? He thought about it, turned his cup once in his hands, the same absent gesture he did with the ring, before he remembered the ring wasn't there to turn anymore. Loud, he said finally. Loud and certain about everything. And usually right, which made the certain part harder to argue with. She wanted to see the ocean. Never got the chance. Used to talk about it like it was a person she was going to meet someday. He looked up. Your mother. What was she like? Something crossed Yen's face, brief and private. She sang while she worked, she said. Every task had a different song. I did not understand as a child that this was a kind of medicine. I understand it now. She glanced at Tuha. Our sister here inherited none of the singing and all of the stubbornness. I inherited the parts that were useful, Atut said, without looking up from her plate, and Yen's mouth curved briefly into something that was almost, for just a moment, entirely unguarded. Grier watched the two of them a moment, and felt something settle into his chest that he didn't yet have a name for, the particular quiet ache of a table that had people around it again, after 5 years of eating alone and telling himself he'd gotten used to it. He hadn't. He understood that now, watching Ituha reach for the cornbread without asking, like she'd already decided this was simply hers to reach for. It was that same week that he'd finally admitted to himself the real reason he hadn't ridden a Tuha into town to see Feasley that first day. He'd told himself it was distance, time, good sense. But underneath that was a memory he didn't examine often an afternoon 2 winters back. A ranch hand named Tomas Aguilar with a crushed hand and no English to speak of, standing on Feasley's porch while the doctor looked him over through the screen door and told him, flat, that his services were reserved for a certain kind of patient and that Tomas ought to try his luck in the next county over. Grier had been there, had watched it happen from the road, and had told himself, at the time, that it wasn't his fight to pick, had ridden on, had let sit in him ever since, small and cold and unaddressed, like a stone-swallowed hole that never quite worked its way through. He wasn't going to make that mistake twice. Not on his own land, with his own hands, and not with anyone under his roof. Garrison Ross came by on a Tuesday, third week, mid-morning. Rode up the creek road on a horse better than necessary for a social call, tied up at the rail with the easy manner of a man who goes where he pleases and has never had reason to feel otherwise. He was 52, built solid, the kind of man who'd been handsome at 30 and had turned that into authority by 50. Ran the largest mercantile operation in Marrow Creek and 3 surrounding towns. Held notes on maybe a third of the ranches in the county, and carried a particular quality to his friendliness that Grier had, until recently simply registered as warmth. He registered it differently now. Couldn't have said exactly why. Or rather, he could now, with a scrap of waxed twine sitting in a drawer in the cabin, but he wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. Grier, said Voss, wide smile. Heard you've got some new arrangements out here. Came by to see how you're getting on. Getting on fine. Voss's eyes moved across the yard, taking inventory the way merchants do. The repaired fence, the horses, the figures of Yen and Ituha, visible working the young stock at the far end of the corral. His fingers moved slightly, counting the corral, the cattle, the outbuildings, everything he could see from where he stood. Not a social visit. An accounting. Quite a situation, Voss said pleasantly. Working ranch, said Grier. Quite a situation for a working ranch. Voss laughed, easy and completely practiced. Course. I'd think twice about how the town's going to receive it. Feasley's not the only one round here with opinions about who belongs where. A pause. Dropped light and careless as anything. Shame, really, if one of them took sick out here and nobody in town would see to it. Grier felt that land somewhere just under his ribs, precise as a thrown knife. They won't need to. I've got what I need. Course you do. Voss's smile didn't move an inch. You know, I've been meaning to talk to you about this land for a while now. The creek access particularly. I've got development interest that would make it worth your while to consider selling. Not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Not this, Grier said. No heat in it, no apology. Just the flat, clean fact. Your daddy said the same thing to me once, Voss said, conversational, like he was remarking on the weather. Almost those exact words, if memory serves. Stubborn streak runs in the family, I suppose. My father's dead, Mr. Voss. I'm aware. Voss's smile didn't so much as flicker. Terrible thing what happened out here. Never did sit right with me, if I'm honest. A man works a piece of land his whole life, and then one bad night takes the whole of it from him. He shook his head, slow, sorrowful, a performance so smooth Grier almost admired the craft of it the way you might admire a well-forged counterfeit coin right up until you understood what it was. Anyhow, no sense dwelling on old grief on a fine morning like this one. No, Grier said. No sense at all. Voss looked at him a moment, still smiling, but something underneath had slipped like a painting where the canvas has started separating from the frame. Almost invisible, but there. Well, said Voss, offer stands. You change your mind, you know where to find me. He gathered his reins, paused. That water of yours. Runs clean the whole year, don't it? Always has. Long as I've known this valley, he said it like a compliment. It didn't land like one. He rode back the way he'd come. Grier watched him go. Yan appeared at his shoulder, silent, the way she did everything. He wanted to see the property, she said. I know. Not you, everything else. I know that too. Ituha, several yards off, had stopped what she was doing. Was watching Voss's retreating figure on his good horse, and the look on her face was the look of someone making a mental note she intends to return to later. Nobody said anything about it, but nobody forgot it either. He mentioned the water, Grier said quietly. Once Voss was well down the road. Twice near enough. Man doesn't mention a thing twice, by accident. No, Yen agreed. He does not. Ituha came over from the corral, wiping her hands on her skirt, her eyes still following the dust of Voss's horse down the creek road. He asked Feasley's threat and the price of your land in the same breath, she said. Did you notice that? The two things were not separate to him. They were the same sentence, only broken in half to sound like manners. Grier turned that over. You think he's the kind of man who'd use a thing like that? Deliberately. I think, Ituha said, that a man who has practiced friendliness as long as he has also practiced knowing exactly which words leave the smallest mark and the longest bruise. She looked at the little twine tag still folded in the drawer inside, though she hadn't seen it. Not yet, that would come later. Another morning, another quiet accounting. For now she only shrugged, the gesture achingly familiar already. 3 weeks in, I am only saying. Watch his hands next time, not his mouth. Grier thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Mending fence he didn't strictly need to mend, because his hands wanted something to do while his mind worked the problem the way Yen worked. A stretch of disturbed ground, slow, patient, refusing to let the obvious answer stand in for the true one until he'd actually looked hard enough to be sure. 2 days after that, a small column of riders crossed the ridge to the north far enough off that Grier only caught the dust of it, and the shape of blue coats catching the light. He watched them a long moment, hand shading his eyes, something in his gut going tight and quiet, without knowing exactly why. Cavalry, Yen said, coming up beside him. Her voice had gone flat in a way he hadn't heard from her yet. You know them? Not yet, she said. But I will. She didn't explain further, and something in her face told him not to ask. He watched her watch the ridge instead and saw, for the first time since the auction, something pass behind her eyes that looked less like assessment and more like old, familiar dread, the kind that doesn't need a name to recognize its own shape, approaching from a distance. The riders didn't come down, just crossed the ridge and were gone, the way weather passes on the far side of a valley visible, and then not, and you're left wondering if you imagined the whole thing, except you didn't, and some part of you knows more of it is coming. The days after that moved differently. Grier noticed it in small things. Yen working the fence line with one eye always drifting toward the northern ridge. Itua keeping her notebook closer, tucked inside her coat instead of left on the windowsill, where the morning light was better for writing in it. Neither of them said much about it out loud. They didn't need to. The whole ranch had taken on the particular, watchful quiet of a place that has heard a sound in the dark and is waiting to hear whether it comes again. He caught himself doing the same thing they were doing, glancing at the ridge more than the work in front of him strictly quiet and understood pod. Somewhere in the third day of it, that whatever this feeling was, it had stopped being only theirs to carry. It had become his too, quietly, the way most things about these past 3 weeks had become his without any formal announcement that they were going to. It was on the fourth day after that, in the late afternoon, that an old man rode into the yard alone on a paint horse that moved like it was in no hurry, and neither was its rider. He was somewhere near 70, weathered down to something that looked carved rather than aged, like he'd been made from the same red rock as the canyon walls, and simply hadn't gotten around to eroding any further. He didn't dismount right away. Sat there a moment, looking at the cabin, the corral, the creek. Looking, Grier understood, the same way Yen had looked at everything that first morning, like the land itself was a document, and he was reading it. Yen came out of the barn at a near run, stopped herself before she reached him, said something low, urgent, in their language. The old man answered, and whatever he said made her go very still. He finally swung down off the horse, walked toward Grier with the unhurried gait of a man who had outlived the need to rush toward anything. You are the one who bought their freedom, he said. Not a question. I am. The old man studied him a long moment, the same unhurried, comprehensive attention Grier was starting to recognize as a family trait. My name is Hascon, he said. I have known these two since they were children small enough to carry. I taught the elder to read tracks before she could read her own name in any language. I have been looking for them for 4 months, since the night our people were scattered a second time, and I had begun to prepare myself for the possibility that I would spend what is left of my life searching and never once find them again. Behind him, Itua had crossed the yard at a near run, despite her ribs, and folded herself against the old man's chest without a word, and Haskin's hand came up to rest against the back of her head, with the particular gentleness of someone who has done that exact gesture 100 times before, across a great many years, and had feared not so long ago that he would never get to do it again. "You are thinner," he said to her, in English now quiet, for Greer's benefit or his own. Grier couldn't tell which. "We will fix that. They're safe here," Greer said. "For now," said Haskin. Something in the way he said it made the yard go quiet. Even the horses seemed to still. "I need to speak with you," Haskin said. "Both of you. Something you should have heard a long time ago, and something I did not have the courage to say sooner." He looked past Greer's shoulder, at Yen, at Ituha standing frozen by the fence rail, at the ridge to the north where the cavalry had passed 2 days before. "It concerns the men who burned the village where these two were raised. And it concerns," he said, turning back to Greer, his voice dropping lower, heavier, like a stone being set down after being carried a long way. "A man whose face I saw 10 years ago in firelight and have seen again more recently wearing a uniform." Grier felt something in his chest go still and cold. "Sit with me," Hascon said. "This will not be a short conversation, and once I have said it, none of you will be able to unhear it." The evening light was going gold and long across the yard. Somewhere behind him Greer heard Yen's breath catch the same catch he'd heard from Ituha on the wagon that first day, the sound of someone bracing against a pain they'd been carrying a long time, and had learned, out of necessity, not to show. He looked at the old man. Looked at the two women who had walked into his life 3 weeks ago, in iron chains, and had somehow, without him quite noticing when it happened, become the reason the ranch felt like a home again, instead of a place he was simply enduring. "All right," Greer said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "Tell me." Hascon looked at him a moment, then, unhurried as ever, glanced toward the cabin, toward the smell of the stew Ituha had put together from what the pantry allowed. "A hungry man tells his truth badly," he said, "and a man who has ridden 4 days on old bones tells it worse than most. Feed me first, Greer Calloway. The truth is not going anywhere tonight. It has waited 10 years already. It can wait one more supper." They ate at the table inside, the 4 of them close in the lamplight, Hascon eating with the slow, deliberate appreciation of a man who had gone without regular meals a good while, and had learned not to waste a single mouthful showing it. He asked Grier about the ranch, how many head, how the water held through the dry months, whether the north pasture still flooded in spring the way it must have, judging by the lay of the land. Grier answered, found himself talking more easily than he expected to, and understood, somewhere in the middle of it, that Hascon was doing on purpose what Yen had done, on the very first night, buying a little time, a little ordinary human warmth before the harder thing arrived. When the plates were cleared, Hascon didn't answer right away. He looked instead toward the creek, where the water ran the way it had run his whole life, clear over the stones, indifferent to everything that had ever happened on its banks, and everything that was about to. "Not tonight," he said finally. "Tonight you feed an old man and let him rest his bones. Tomorrow, when the sun is up and your mind is clear, I will tell you what I saw. And you will have to decide, Greer Calloway, what kind of man you intend to be once you know it." The fire popped once, low in the growing dark, and Greer understood, without being told, that whatever came next was going to cost him something he hadn't yet learned the name of, and that there was no road leading backward from this yard. To the man he'd been 3 weeks ago, riding into town with 3 simple things on his mind, and a ring on his hand that was by now sitting behind a dusty pawn-shop window a day's ride away, gathering dust and waiting, the way everything in this country seemed to wait, for its own reckoning. Morning came in slow and gray over the rock walls, the kind of light that hadn't decided yet what the day was going to be. Grier hadn't slept. Not really. He'd lain on his cot doing the thing he did now, apparently, every night turning over ground that used to be solid and finding it soft in places he hadn't checked before. Somewhere past midnight he'd given up entirely on the pretense of trying, and had simply lain there listening to the ordinary sounds of the ranch settling into its own version of stillness, a horse shifting in the corral, the creek's low constant murmur, once faintly, what might have been Ituha's voice from the loft, though he couldn't have said whether she was talking in her sleep or simply awake and thinking out loud the way people do when they believe no one else is listening. He'd thought, lying there, about the word Ituha had taught him. Water that does not stop. He turned it over in his mouth once, quiet, in the dark, and found it settled something in his chest he hadn't known was unsettled, the way a small true thing sometimes does more work than a larger deliberate one. Haskin was already at the fire when Grier came out, sitting on an overturned crate like it was a throne he'd been using his whole life. Coffee in a tin cup. Watching the light change on the canyon walls with the patience of a man who had at some point long ago stopped being in a hurry about anything. You didn't sleep, Hascon said. Not a question. No. Good. A man should not sleep easy the night before he learns something that will not let him sleep easy again. Grier sat. The coffee Haskin handed him without being asked was strong enough to strip paint, and he was grateful for it in a way that had nothing to do with taste. You slept, Grier said. Or did you? An old man does not sleep the way a young man sleeps, Haskin said. I rest. There is a difference. Resting, I have found, leaves more room for thinking than sleeping does, and I did a great deal of thinking last night, watching your fire burn down and wondering whether I had made the right choice, coming here saying what I am about to say. He looked at Grier directly. I have decided that I have. But I will tell you plainly, Grier Calloway, I have turned this decision over more times in the last 4 days than I have turned any decision in longer than I can remember, and I am not entirely at peace with it yet. I do not know that I ever will be. Yen and Ituha came out of the barn together, and something in the way they moved told him they hadn't slept either. Ituha's hand found the edge of her ribs without her seeming to notice she was doing it. Old habit, bracing for something before it arrived. Hascon didn't wait for them to settle, didn't ease into it, just started talking, the way a man does when he's been carrying a thing so long that once he starts setting it down, he can't stop halfway through. 10 years ago, he said, I watched a village burn in 3 places at once. The fire popped. Nobody moved, there was no moon that night, which matters, because a man who plans an attack under a moon wants to be seen. A man who plans it under no moon wants only the fire to be seen. After, he turned his cup slowly in his hands. I was young enough to still believe there were rules to these things, that soldiers followed orders that came from somewhere reasonable. I do not believe that anymore. You were there, Yen said. Her voice had gone somewhere flat and far away. I was on the rise above it, said Haskin. I could not reach the village in time. I could only watch. He paused, and in the firelight, I saw the face of the man who gave the order. He sat his horse very still. He did not shout. He did not need to. He watched until it was finished, and then he turned his horse, and he rode away without any expression on his face at all, as if he were watching weather pass, as if it cost him nothing. Grier felt something cold settle into his chest, though he didn't yet understand why it was his to feel. I have carried that face for 10 years, Haskin said. I did not have a name for it, only the face and the stillness of it, and the way he turned his horse. He looked up, looked directly at Grier. 4 days ago, he said, I saw that face again, riding through Marrow Creek, in a blue coat with a captain's bar on his collar. The yard went silent enough that Grier could hear the creek moving over its stones, 40 yards off, indifferent as ever. Captain Silas Cade, Grier said. His own voice sounded strange to him. Far away. That is the name they use for him now, said Hascon. It was not the name I knew him by then, but the face does not change. A man can put a different coat on a different lie. The face underneath stays the same. Ituha had gone very still, the particular stillness Grier had learned. Over 3 weeks meant she was holding something enormous behind a very thin wall. Yen didn't move at all. He's been through here, Grier said slowly. 2 days ago. A column on the north ridge, I saw the dust. Then he is looking, said Hascon, which means he has not forgotten either. Men who have done a thing like this do not forget. They only get better at looking calm while they carry it. Grier sat with that. Somewhere in his chest, a 5-year-old certainty was finishing the work of coming apart the story he'd told himself about his own family's death, the raiders, the horses, all of it. And underneath the wreckage of that certainty was something worse, something that had a face now, and a rank, and a reason to keep riding this territory, like he owned every foot of it. Why, Grier said, why would a cavalry officer burn a village that wasn't threatening anyone? Hascon was quiet a long moment. That, he said, I do not know. Some men do terrible things for orders. Some men do terrible things and invent the orders afterward to have something to stand behind. I only know what I saw. The reason is a door I have not been able to open in 10 years. Then we open it, Grier said. Everyone looked at him. He hadn't planned to say it. It had come out of him the same way $500 had come out of him on an auction platform 3 weeks ago, before his mind had caught up to his mouth, clean and a little insane, but he didn't take it back. You said it yourself, he said, looking at Haskin. The face doesn't change, which means the truth doesn't either. Somewhere there's a reason, and reasons leave tracks the same as men do. I don't know how to read a trail through 10 years, but I know people who might. He looked at Yen, at Tatua, whose eyes had come back into focus, sharp now, alert in a way he hadn't seen from her yet. We're not going to hunt him down tomorrow, Greer said. I'm not fool enough to think that. But I'm not going to sit on this land and pretend I didn't hear it, either. He looked at the fire. Somebody attacked my family, and let the world believe it was your people. Somebody attacked your village and is walking around in a captain's coat like it never happened. I don't know yet if those two things are connected. He paused. But I've got a feeling in my gut that says they might be. And my gut hasn't steered me wrong since the day I bid too strange at an auction I no business being at. Something moved across Yen's face. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. Same as the first day. You are a strange man, Grier Calloway, she said. I've been told. Hascon set his cup down. There is more, he said. The village that was burned. What remained of our people has been running since. Some months in hiding, some scattered to relatives, some caught, as you two were caught. His eyes went to Yen and Ituha, gentle now, the way a grandfather's eyes go gentle even when the words are hard. There are 23 of us left who have not been taken, and are running out of places to run. Where are they now? Where are they now? Greer asked. 2 days from here, in the canyon country to the west. Hiding, badly, in a place too easily found. I came ahead to find you two. He looked at Yen. I did not expect to find a rancher willing to say what he just said. The yard was quiet a long moment. The creek moved. A horse stamped in the corral. Bring them here, Greer said. Ituha's head came up sharp. You understand what you are offering. I'm starting to. 23 pull, she said, on land the cavalry already has an interest in. If they are found here. They won't be found here, Greer said, because we're not going to let them be found here. It came out steadier than he felt. Underneath it, some small, sane part of him was already doing the arithmetic, the same kind of arithmetic he'd done outside the land office 3 weeks ago. $347 against a promise he had no business making. He was doing that math again now, and coming up short again, and deciding again that the gap was worth finding a way to close. Hascon studied him a long moment, the kind of look that weighed a man clean through. You said a simple reason once, he told Greer, though Greer hadn't told him anything of the sort, and it took him a second to understand Hascon must have heard it secondhand, from Yen, sometime in the last 4 days. Simple reasons are either very true or very dishonest. Which is yours? Grier thought about the ring behind a dusty window in a town he could still smell dust from. True, he said. Hascon nodded once, like a man closing a ledger. Then I will send word today, he said. It will take them 2 days to travel safely. You should use that time to prepare places for people to disappear. Yen was already moving before he finished the sentence, walking the fence line with her eyes narrowed, already mapping the land, the way she'd mapped his tracks that first morning. Itua had gone to the cabin for paper, for something to write on, because that, Grier was starting to understand, was simply what Itua did with fear. She turned it into ink. And Grier stood in the middle of his own yard, feeling the shape of his life rearrange itself around a decision he'd made in about 4 seconds, the same way he seemed to make every decision that actually mattered, which he thought, watching Yen pace the fence line with that fierce, focused calm, was maybe not such a bad way to live after all. The first of the 2 days passed in a blur of practical work that left no room for second-guessing, which suited Greer fine, 'cause second-guessing was all his mind wanted to do the moment his hands slowed down. He and Yen walked the entire perimeter of the ranch together, marking in low voices every fold of rock, every stand of brush thick enough to swallow a person whole, every low place in the creek bed, where the overhang cut deep enough to hide a body from the road. Here, Yen said, at the third such spot, crouching to test the depth of the overhang with her forearm. 5, maybe 6, if they lie close. She looked up the bank toward the ranch buildings, and close enough to reach quickly if the alarm comes at night. You've done this before, Greer said. It wasn't quite a question. I have done everything before, Yen said without looking at him, still measuring the overhang with her eyes. That is what surviving this long means. Not that terrible things stop happening. Only that you stop being surprised by how to answer them. They stopped, near dusk that first day, at the last of the 4 spots, a wide shelf of rock above the creek, where the water had cut a shallow cave into the bank over some number of centuries neither of them could have guessed at. Yen sat on the edge of it a moment, looking down at the water, and Greer sat a careful distance away, because that had become its own kind of unspoken rule between them. Distance measured out with the same care she measured everything. "You are frightened," she said, not looking at him. Not an accusation. Simple observation. The same tone she'd used to note a change in weather. "Yes, good," Yen said. "A man who is not frightened by what we are about to do has not understood the size of it." She picked up a smooth stone from the creek bed, turned it once in her fingers, set it back down exactly where she'd found it. An old habit he'd noticed in her before. She rarely took anything from a place without also considering what the place would look like once she'd gone. "I was frightened the first time I hid people. I was 12 years old. My mother put her hand over my mouth in the dark, and I thought, for one entire night, that she meant to smother me rather than let me be found. I understand now that she was only teaching me how quiet needs to be. That's a hell of a thing to learn at 12. "It is," Yen agreed. "It is also why I am alive to tell you about it." She looked at him then, finally, in the low gold light coming off the water. "You did not have to learn this. Your whole life, until 3 weeks ago, you did not have to learn any of it. That is not something to apologize for, Greer Calloway. It is only something I notice about you. You are learning fast, for a man who never needed to. Feels less like learning and more like getting handed a debt I didn't know I owed." "Perhaps," Yen said. "Or perhaps it is only what happens when a man finally looks at the whole of the world instead of only the part of it that was convenient to see." She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, offered him a hand up that he hadn't strictly needed and took anyway, because refusing it, he was starting to understand, would have been its own small unkindness. "Come. There is more ground to walk before the light goes." They found 4 such places by the end of the first day, and Yen set Greer and 2 of the ranch's older horses to work widening the space beneath the barn floor, a task that involved considerably more digging than Greer had anticipated, and left him with blistered palms and a grudging new respect for how much labor Yen had clearly overseen in her life without once, as far as he could tell, breaking a sweat over the planning of it. "They come in the dark," Yen said, that evening, going over the last of it by lamplight. "Small groups, never more than 5 at once, moving through the brush between the rocks, not the open ground. If anyone is watching this ranch, and I believe someone is, they will see a working ranch settling in for the night. Nothing more. And if they're watching close enough to count heads coming in, then we have already lost," Yen said simply. "So we will not let that happen." They came in the dark, over the next 2 nights, in groups of 3 and 4 and 5, moving through the scrub brush between the rock formations, with a quiet that Greer found almost eerie, the same quiet Yen had tried, patiently and with visible amusement at his clumsiness, to teach him during the day. He was still bad at it. They were not. They were not soldiers. Greer understood that the moment the first group came into the firelight, and he could see their faces properly. An older woman who moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to carry great dignity through great difficulty. A small cloth bundle held against her chest, like it, contained the last of everything she owned, which Greer would learn later it very nearly did. A young couple, hands linked, eyes doing the fast, practiced scan of people who had arrived at too many strange places and learned to check the exits first. A man near Haskins' age who nodded once at Greer and said nothing at all, and whose silence somehow said more than most men's speeches. Families, elders, people who had been running, and hiding and running again, for months, with nothing left to spend but each other. Haskon told him some of it, that first night, sitting apart from the fire while the camp settled itself into its new geography. Not all of it, Greer understood, listening, that some of it Haskon simply wasn't going to hand over easily, the way a man doesn't hand over the deepest of his wounds to someone who's only just arrived to ask about them. But enough. The first scattering 10 years back, the night the village burned. The years after, spent rebuilding in smaller numbers, further from anywhere a cavalry patrol might think to look, until a kind of fragile ordinary life had grown back over the wound the way scrub grass grows back over a burn scar, thinner than what was there before, but alive. And then 4 months ago, the second attack. Smaller this time, Haskins said. Quieter, no fire this time, just riders in the night and chains, and the particular efficiency of men who had done this exact thing before and had gotten better at it since. We had begun to believe we were safe, Haskins said, and something in his voice, for the first time since Greer had met him, cracked just slightly at the edges. That is, I think, the cruelest part of it, not the danger itself. The hope that comes back in between the dangers, and how much more it costs you when the next one arrives to find that hope standing there, undefended, believing the worst had already happened. Grier didn't have an answer for that, just sat with it, the way he'd learned, over the last month, that some things didn't want an answer. Just a witness. Grier stood on his porch and watched them come into his yard, and something shifted in his chest that he didn't have an exact word for yet. Not heroism, nothing so clean as that. More like a reckoning the sense of a life aligning itself with something it had been slightly out of true with for years, clicking into a position that was uncomfortable and complicated and entirely correct. Yen organized everything with the brisk, precise efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before, in worse conditions, with less time. Sleeping space distributed across the barn loft, the cabin's back room, a lean-to going up fast against the south canyon wall. A cook fire small enough to disassemble and hide inside 10 minutes. Water runs timed to minimize the trail worn into the ground. Grier kept the cattle moving through the yard on a rotation, deliberately, to churn the dirt into a mess no tracker could read cleanly. It was Yen's idea. He was only smart enough to follow it. By the second night, 12 had arrived. An elderly couple who'd walked the last 6 miles because their one remaining horse had gone lame 2 days back, and who accepted Grier's offer of the second horse in his corral with a kind of formal, careful gratitude that made him feel for a moment wildly undeserving of it. A woman near Yan's age with a burn scar along one forearm, who introduced herself simply as a healer, and who took one look at Ituha's careful, guarded movements and asked without preamble to see the ribs for herself and pronounced Grier's wrapping, after a long, thorough examination, competent enough that she wouldn't need to redo it, which Grier understood, from the flicker of surprise on Ituha's face, was higher praise than it sounded. It was on the second evening, with the fire pit banked low and most of the group settled, that a rider came in from the west that Grier didn't recognize. He was maybe 30, built like someone had assembled him specifically for the purpose of being difficult to argue with, heavy through the shoulders, a face that had passed through handsome sometime in his 20s, and arrived, somewhere since, at something closer to formidable. He dismounted without being invited to, and walked straight up to Grier with his jaw already set. "You're the rancher," he said. Not a question. An accusation dressed as a fact. Grier Calloway Tavik. He said it like it cost him something to be civil enough to offer it. "Yen's cousin, good to meet you." "I don't trust you," Tavik said, flat. First thing out of his mouth. No warm-up. Hands loose at his sides. But the whole set of him clearly ready to be unpleasant if the situation called for it. "Men like you do things like this because it makes you feel large, and when it stops making you feel large, you stop doing it." "That's a fair concern," Grier said. Tavik blinked. Had clearly expected an argument. "I can't prove you wrong," Grier went on, "until I've had the chance to be wrong and wasn't. So I'm not going to try. Watch me." A long pause. Tavik's jaw worked once, like he was chewing on the fact that Grier hadn't given him anything to push against. "That's fair," he said finally, grudging, which was as close to agreement as the man apparently allowed himself. "You're welcome to the loft if you want it," Grier added. "Or the barn floor. Or you can stand out here, glaring at me all night if that suits you better. Man's got to sleep somewhere." Something flickered at the corner of Tavik's mouth, gone almost before it arrived, that might, in a more generous light, have been the beginning of amusement he wasn't yet ready to admit to. He looked past Grier, to where Yen stood near the fire. Something passed between the two of them, years of shorthand, the particular language of family that doesn't need words to carry weight. Tavik looked back at Grier, said nothing more, which wasn't agreement. But it wasn't walking away either. Then he pulled Yen a few steps aside and lowered his voice, and Grier close enough, and apparently not as good at pretending not to listen as he'd like to think, caught enough of it to feel the floor tilt under him a second time in 1 week. The canyon location. The place Hascon had left the rest of the group hiding, before the move to Grier's ranch. It hadn't just been a risk. It had been compromised, known, sold. "How?" Grier said, walking over, not bothering to pretend anymore that he hadn't heard. Tavik looked at him, weighing something, then apparently decided the time for keeping Grier out of it had passed. "Someone in Marrow Creek," he said. "Someone with access to supply patterns. We sent riders in 3 weeks ago for provisions rope, water skins, dried meat, in the kind of quantities that tell an observant man a group is moving, not a family settling down. He paused. An observant man noticed, and that man talked to the cavalry. Which cavalry? Grier said, though he already knew, in the cold, sinking way you know the second half of a sentence before it's finished. Cade has a patrol positioned near the old canyon route, Tavik said, waiting for the group to fully assemble before moving in. He knew where we were going to be 3 days before we got there. The fire cracked. Somewhere behind them, one of the elders murmured something low in their own language, and another voice answered, and Grier understood without needing the words translated, that the fear in this yard hadn't fully set down yet, and might not for a long while. How many people are still headed for that canyon? Grier asked. 11. Maybe 12. Riders left 3 days ago to catch them before they arrived. Then they come here instead, Grier said. All of them. Now. Tavik stared at him. You understand what you're saying? I understand exactly what I'm saying. 23 people, Tavik said. On a ranch the cavalry is already watching. I'm working on that part, Grier said. A plan, Tavik said flat. Very reassuring. Do you have a better one? Silence. Long enough that Grier heard the creak again. Patient underneath everything. The way it had probably been patient underneath every hard conversation this land had ever held. No, Tavik admitted finally. I don't. The remaining group arrived 4 nights later, exhausted and thinner than Grier had braced himself for, having doubled back twice to shake a patrol that had gotten close enough to hear at one point, close enough that one of the younger men in the group, quiet, watchful, the kind of quiet that comes from having had to be very still very often, still had the tight, wide-eyed look of someone whose heart hadn't fully believed, yet, that it was allowed to slow back down. Grier found him sitting apart from the fire that first night, and sat down near him without asking permission, the way he'd learned watching Yen. That permission sometimes needed to be offered by presence, rather than words. First time that close, the young man said finally. Not quite a question. Close as they came? Close enough to hear a horse breathing. 20 feet, maybe less. We lay in a wash for an hour not moving. He looked at Grier sideways. You get used to running. You never get used to that. No, Grier said. I don't imagine you do. They sat there a while, not talking, the fire popping low, and Grier understood that this simply sitting, simply not leaving a person alone, with the particular echo that kind of fear leaves behind, was its own kind of medicine, the kind his mother had never had to teach him because some things, apparently, you just knew. By the time the last of them came in, the yard held 23 people who were not soldiers, were not fighters by trade, and were, every one of them, exactly what Captain Silas Cade had apparently decided didn't matter. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Grier hadn't expected and wouldn't have known how to plan for if he'd tried. 23 extra people on a working ranch turned out to mean 23 extra sets of hands. And hands, it turned out, wanted work, the way anything living wants purpose, not out of obligation, but because idleness and a hiding place has a way of curdling into its own kind of misery. And everyone in that yard had had quite enough misery to last several lifetimes already. The healer with the burn scar, whose name Grier learned was Nayeli, took over the garden plot behind the cabin that Grier had let go fallow for 2 years, and within a week had it producing more than he'd ever managed to coax out of that stretch of dirt in a decade of half-hearted effort. The elderly man with the lame horse turned out to have been a saddler in his younger years, and set up a small repair station in the corner of the barn that had every strap and buckle on the property looking better than new within 10 days. Tavik and 2 of the younger men took over the heaviest fence work without being asked, and Grier came out one morning to find an entire stretch of the south boundary, a stretch he'd been quietly dreading for a month, already standing straight and true, like it had simply decided to fix itself overnight. You didn't have to do that, Grier told Tavik, standing there taking in the work. No, Tavik agreed. We wanted to. He didn't look up from the post he was setting. There is a difference between a man who is given shelter and does nothing with it, and a man who is given shelter and builds something worth defending. I have decided which kind I intend to be while I am here. The others have decided the same. A pause, and something in his voice shifted just slightly towards something less guarded than anything he'd offered Grier yet. It is not only for you. I want that understood. Understood, Grier said. Wouldn't have expected otherwise. It wasn't all easy between them, those first 2 weeks. Tavik ran hot in a way Grier had learned to read early, not cruel, never cruel, but quick to suspect the worst explanation for anything that looked even slightly out of place. There was a morning, 10 days in, when a crate of provisions came up short, and Tavik's first assumption, spoken loud enough for half the yard to hear, was that Greer had been skimming supplies, meant for the camp to cover his own shortfall. "Count it again," Greer said flat, not rising to it. "Then come find me." Tavik counted it again. Found the missing sacks exactly where they'd been all along, moved the day before by one of the younger men reorganizing the barn loft for more sleeping space, an entirely innocent mistake that had simply slipped past being mentioned to anyone. He found Greer by the corral afterward, jaw tight, the particular stiffness of a proud man working up to an apology he didn't enjoy owing. "I was wrong," Tavik said. "No preamble, same as everything else about him. Appreciate you coming to say so." "I did not come to make you feel appreciated," Tavik said, with the ghost of something dry in it. "I came because being wrong and not admitting it is a worse thing than being wrong in the first place. My mother taught me that. I did not always listen to her while she was alive. I try to listen now. Good policy." "It is the only policy I have," Tavik said, and that Greer was beginning to understand was as close to warmth as the man was likely to offer on any given day, and it was somehow entirely enough. One of the younger men, quiet, watchful, the same one who'd frozen in the wash during the run from the canyon, whose name Greer had learned by then, was Koya, asked him, a few days into the settling, whether he'd teach him to rope. Said it plain, no explanation offered for why, though Greer suspected, without needing it spelled out, that a man who'd spent months learning to be perfectly still might want, badly, to learn something that moved. They spent an hour at it most evenings after that, Greer throwing loop after loop at a fence post while quiet himself, missing wide the first dozen times in ways that made both of them laugh despite the seriousness underlying everything else about that month. "You're overthinking the wrist," Greer told him, the fifth evening running. "You are under-explaining the wrist," Koya shot back, dry enough that Greer nearly dropped his own rope laughing, and threw again, and this time the loop settled clean over the post, and Koya's grin, when it arrived, was the first one Greer had seen on him that reached all the way to his eyes. "There it is," Greer said. "There it is," Koya agreed, coiling the rope back up with hands that were, for the first time, in longer than he'd probably admit, not thinking about anything but the rope. Mornings, in that stretch, had a shape to them Greer had never known a ranch could have. He'd wake to the smell of a fire already going, coffee already on, and step out to find the yard humming with a kind of purposeful, quiet industry that made his own 5 years of solitary chores look, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly small. Nayeli's garden, the saddler's repair bench. Two of the younger men who'd taken it upon themselves to reinforce the corral fence without being asked, working with an easy, competitive banter between them that reminded Greer, achingly, of the kind of noise a working ranch was supposed to have and hadn't on his land in 5 long years. He caught himself laughing out loud one morning, actually laughing, the sound surprising him nearly as much as it seemed to surprise Atuha, who delivered the line that caused it with her usual flat, deadly seriousness. Something about the state of his coffee-making that he could no longer entirely recall the wording of, only the sensation of it landing, and the strange, rusty feeling of his own laughter coming back online after a long time in storage. "You laugh like a man out of practice," Tavik observed from across the yard, not unkind. "I am a man out of practice." "Then you should do it more," Tavik said, and went back to his fence post. And Greer stood there a moment in the morning light, turning that small, gruff kindness over in his hands like it was worth something, because it was. There was a near thing, on the 6th night of the full camp, nothing that made it into anyone's account of what happened those weeks, because nothing came of it, but it lived in Greer's memory afterward, with a clarity that the larger, louder dangers somehow never quite matched. A single rider had come up the creek road, well past midnight, moving slow, deliberate, the kind of pace that suggested someone either lost or looking. Yen had gone still at the sound of hooves, before Greer had even fully registered it, and within the space of 30 seconds the yard had gone from a scattering of quiet evening activity to something that, to an outside eye, would have looked like nothing at all, because everyone who needed to disappear had simply, silently, stopped being visible. The rider turned out to be nothing. A drunk cowhand from a neighboring spread, thoroughly lost and thoroughly harmless, who Greer walked back onto the main road with a canteen of water and a few pointed directions and never saw again. But Greer had stood in his own yard that night, heart going hard enough to feel in his teeth, and understood for the first time in his gut what it must feel like to live every single night the way this camp had been living for months. Not fear of one thing. Fear of every possible thing, all the time, that never quite got the chance to rest. He found Ituha afterward, sitting up on the porch step, instead of sleeping, and sat down beside her without a word. "You get used to it," she said, after a while, unprompted, like she'd known exactly what he was thinking. It becomes a kind of second hearing. You stop noticing you're doing it. Then one day someone tells you that you flinch at doors closing and you realize you had not noticed that either. That's no way to live. No, Ituha agreed. It is only the way we have had to. She looked at him sideways. You are doing it too. Now, I have watched you start. 3 weeks ago, you would have slept through that rider entirely. He thought about that a long while after she'd gone up to the loft, sitting alone on the step, with the night gone quiet again, and understood that whatever else this month had cost him, it had also handed him something he hadn't asked for, and wasn't sure yet how to hold a version of watchfulness he'd never needed before, because nothing, in 5 years of grieving alone on this land, had ever felt worth watching for quite this hard. It was 3 nights after the last group arrived that Greer found Ituha at the creek before dawn, sitting on the flat rock above the water, with a small notebook in her lap, and a stub of charcoal moving fast across the page. He sat down near her, said nothing at first. The sky above the canyon walls was doing that thing it did before sunrise black, sliding into deep blue, sliding into something almost purple at the edges. The kind of sky that reminded a man the world was very old, and did not especially care about his problems, which was, in its own strange way, comforting. "You've been writing," he said finally. Itua didn't look up. "I have been paying attention. Since when?" "Since the day Voss came to the ranch," she said. "I watched his hands the whole visit. Not his face a man's face can perform. His hands are harder to control." She turned the page toward him, just enough that he could see the neat, careful handwriting inside. He counted the corral, the cattle, the buildings, everything he could see from where he stood. That was not a social visit. That was an accounting. Grier remembered the visit. Remembered thinking something had felt wrong and not being able to name it. She had named it 3 weeks ago, and said nothing, because she'd been waiting. He understood now, for the moment, it would matter. "And the supply run," he said slowly. "The one that gave away the canyon." "Tavik's riders went to the mercantile," Itua said. "Voss's mercantile. Bought rope, dried meat, water skins. The kind of order that tells anyone paying attention that people are about to move, and move far." She looked at him. Voss is a man who built his whole business on noticing what people don't think they're showing him. Grier sat with that a long moment. "You think it's him," he said. "Not just Katie acting alone. I think," Itua said carefully, "that a captain with a company of men does not need a merchant's help to find people hiding in his own territory, unless the merchant is the one telling him where to look. That's not proof." "No," she agreed. "It is a shape. Shapes can be filled in." She opened the notebook again, turned a page for him. Careful entries in tight, even script. Entry 3. Voss rode out toward the old military road 4 days after our supply run, and did not return to Marrow Creek until the following evening. Entry 4. A patrol was seen near the canyon route the very next morning, which is a full day's ride from where Voss was said to have gone, unless a man rode through the night to deliver something that could not wait. She turned another page. Entry 6. The feed store owner mentioned, in passing while I was buying salt, that Voss had settled an old debt of his in cash 3 weeks back. More cash than a mercantile owner keeps loose in a drawer, in the ordinary run of things. She closed the notebook. I have 7 entries so far. Small things. The timing of Cade's visits against the timing of Voss's trips out of town. None of it proves anything alone. Together, it is starting to look like something. Grier looked at her, 19 years old, ribs not yet fully healed, sitting on a rock in the dark, writing down a pattern nobody else in this whole territory had thought to look for. "Don't," he started. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me it's not remarkable." She almost smiled. First time he'd seen it, all the way through. "I was going to say it isn't. It's simply paying attention, which is what people like me have always had to do, because we were never given the choice of not doing it." The creek moved. Somewhere behind them, the camp was starting to stir. Low voices, the smell of a fire being coaxed back to life. "Keep writing," Greer said. "I intend to," said Ituha. I was going to whether you asked or not. He believed her. There was a night, somewhere in the second week of the full camp, when Greer found himself unable to shake a low, persistent dread that had nothing to do with soldiers or surveys or anything he could point to directly, just the accumulated weight of responsibility for 23 lives sitting on a ranch he'd only ever run for himself, badly, in the years since his family died. He walked the fence line alone well past midnight, unable to settle, and found Yen already out there ahead of him, sitting on the top rail with her eyes on the dark ridge to the north. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." He climbed up beside her, the rail creaking under both their weight. "Some nights, the arithmetic just won't sit still," he admitted. 23 people. One ranch. One rancher who's never had to be responsible for anything bigger than his own cattle count. Yen was quiet a while, looking at the stars rather than at him. "You are afraid you will fail us," she said. "Not a question." "Something like that." "Good," she said again, the same word she'd used once before, and he was starting to understand it wasn't dismissal. Coming from her, it was closer to respect. A man who is not afraid failing the people depending on him has usually already begun to. Fear, used correctly, is only a kind of care that has not yet found its shape. She looked at him now, steady, the starlight catching the edges of her face. "You have not failed us yet, Greer Calloway. 23 people are asleep behind you tonight who were homeless a month ago. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal of something. Doesn't always feel like enough. It rarely does," Yen said. "I have found that the feeling of having done enough and the fact of having done enough are two entirely separate animals, and only a fool trusts the feeling over the fact." She bumped his shoulder with hers, lightly, an unexpected small warmth in it. "Go to sleep. The fence will still be here to worry about in the morning. It has been very patient with you so far." He laughed, quiet, surprised by it again the way he kept being surprised by his own laughter these days. "That a professional opinion?" "It is an observation," Yen said, "from someone who has spent a great deal of her life learning exactly how much a person can carry before the carrying breaks them. You are not close to that point yet. I would tell you if you were." He believed that too, and found, walking back toward the cabin a while later, with her steady presence beside him in the dark, that it had done more to settle his mind than an entire night of pacing the fence line alone ever could have. 2 days later, he took her into Marrow Creek himself, under the plain cover of a supply run, neither of them dressed up as anything more than that. She sat quiet in the back of the wagon, under a wide-brimmed hat borrowed from the saddler, watching the town go by through narrowed eyes. And while Grier handled the ordinary business at the feed store, she slipped away to the boardwalk outside the bank, sweeping broom borrowed for the occasion from an obliging shopkeeper's daughter, who apparently found Itua's quiet, watchful company preferable to her own company, and spent the better part of an hour listening. She came back to the wagon with 2 new entries, and a look on her face that told Greer, before she'd said a word, that at least one of them mattered. Voss met with a man from the assay office. 3 days passed, she said. Once they were well clear of town, the wagon wheel loud enough on the rutted road to cover the conversation from anyone who might have been listening. Paid him for a survey, a land survey, of a parcel that runs along the creek, north of the current property line. "My property line, yours," Ituha confirmed. "He is already having the ground measured, Grier Calloway, before any court has said a single word about who it belongs to." Grier's hands tightened on the reins. "Man's awful confident for someone who doesn't own the land yet. A man like that," Ituha said, "has likely never once in his life needed to be less than confident. Confidence has always worked for him before. That is, I think, going to be his mistake." She settled back against the wagon boards, notebook already open on her knee, charcoal already moving. Men who have never lost rarely plan well for the first time they do. He believed her. He caught the 2 of them together at the creek, another evening that same week, and stayed back far enough not to intrude, close enough to see it. Yen sat behind her sister, working through Itua's hair with slow, careful hands, rebraiding it the way she must have done 1,000 times across their whole lives. The 2 of them talking low in their own language, unhurried, the particular ease of people who had run out of things they needed to prove to each other a very long time ago. At one point, Ituha said something that made Yen's head tip back, laughing a full laugh. Nothing held back from it, the kind Greer had never once heard from her before and wouldn't hear again for some while after. He didn't understand the words. Didn't need to. Understood instead. that he was watching something that had survived a burned village, and a chain and an auction block, and 4 months of running, and had come out the other side of all of it still fully, stubbornly, itself. He went back to the barn without letting either of them see him standing there, because some things he was learning a man ought to witness quietly and then simply carry without ever needing to announce that he had. It was 2 days after the trip into Marrow Creek that a rider Grier didn't recognize came up the creek road, not Voss himself, but a younger man in a well-kept coat who introduced himself as working the mercantile's books. Sent out, he said, to confirm boundary markers ahead of a survey Voss's office had on file. He carried a folded map in a manner so carefully polite it made the hair on the back of Grier's neck stand up before the man had finished dismounting. Didn't know there was a survey pending, Grier said, keeping his voice easy, keeping his body between the visitor and the working stock at the far end of the yard, where Yen had already, without being told, begun herding 2 of the newer arrivals toward the barn with the unhurried casualness of someone simply moving cattle. Routine matter, the young man said, unfolding his map on the tailgate of Grier's own wagon like he owned it. Mr. Voss likes his records current. Nothing more than that. He traced a line along the paper with one finger, glanced up and let his eyes drift, deliberate, slow, across the yard behind Grier, the same counting look Voss himself had given the place weeks back, though clumsier in this younger man's hands, easier to catch doing it. You'll want to survey from the road, Grier said. This is working land. I've got hands-moving stock, and I'd rather nobody got trampled on Mr. Voss's account. The young man's smile thinned, just slightly, the way Voss's own had that day at the corral. Wouldn't want that, he agreed, and folded his map back up, and rode out without pressing further, though he took his time about it, and Grier watched him go with the distinct, unpleasant sense of a man who has just watched someone count his cattle through a spyglass and call it courtesy. He was measuring more than the fence line, Itua said. Once the rider was well down the road, notebook already open. I noticed. I will add it to the shape, she said, and did. 10 days into the camp, settling Grier had started keeping rough count in his head, the way he counted seasons on the ranch, in weather and chores rather than dates on a calendar. The dust came up over the eastern ridge, and he saw it before anyone said a word. He'd learned enough by now to know what that kind of dust meant. Loose and easy, that was a few riders passing through. No trouble. This was tight and rising, and moving with the particular discipline of a column that had somewhere specific to be. That's not a patrol, Yen said, coming up beside him, shading her eyes against the glare. That's an operation. How many, Grier asked. 50. Maybe more. 50 men. An hour out. Maybe less. The yard went through a transformation Grier would remember for the rest of his life in fragments rather than a single continuous memory. It happened too fast, too completely, for his mind to hold it as one smooth motion. One moment there were 23 people visible about their morning business. The next, the count seemed to simply thin, person by person, without any single dramatic movement he could point to and say there, that was when it happened. It was less like people fleeing and more like a held breath being let out slow, the yard exhaling itself down to something that could pass at a glance for ordinary. Hascon caught his eye across the thinning crowd, and something passed between them that needed no words, the old man's calm, settling over Grier like a hand on the shoulder, steadying him for whatever was about to walk up that road. Breathe, Grier Calloway, Hascon said as he passed. Fear that shows on the face is fear that gives away more than fear that stays in the chest where it belongs. I have done this before. So will you. Any tips on how? Think of something true and ordinary, Haskin said. Hold that in your face, instead. It is easier to lie about a small thing when you are thinking, truly, about a larger one. He moved on toward the lean-to, unhurried as ever, and Grier stood there a moment longer, trying to find something true and ordinary to hold on to, and settled, in the end, on the sound of the creek, which was still running, the same as it had every single day of his life, indifferent to 50 riders or 500, and somehow that steadied him more than anything else could have. Yen didn't waste time on fear. Grier watched her switch, in the space of a single breath, into the same brisk, commanding calm she'd used to organize the camp on the first night. 23 people, about to disappear into the geography of a ranch that had, over 3 weeks, quietly grown a second skin nobody riding up from the road would ever see. The cave system in the North Rocks took 6. The deep overhang along the creek bed took 5 more. The hollow space beneath the barn floor, The one Grier had blistered his hands digging out took 4, including the elderly couple with the lame horse, who went down into the dark without a word of complaint, the old man patting Grier's shoulder once, briefly on his way past, in a gesture that needed no translation at all. The rest scattered into roles that could pass, at a glance, as simply what a working ranch looked like. The 12 whose features read most clearly as our people, Yen said. Moving fast now. Become ranch hands for the hour. Mexican labor. Passing through. Most of us have enough Spanish from the border trade to hold a short conversation. She looked at Grier. It will not survive a long conversation. It only has to survive a short one. It's not a perfect plan, Grier said. No, Yen agreed. It is the plan we have. Grier was standing in the yard, going over the last of it with her when Atuha appeared at his elbow, silent the way she'd learned to move over these 3 weeks, and put a folded piece of paper into his hand. He opened it. Careful, precise handwriting. Every detail Haskon had spoken the night he'd first told the story, the date, the place, the description of a captain sitting his horse still in the firelight while a village burned in 3 places at once. Haskon's mark at the bottom, not quite a signature, a symbol Grier had seen the old man use on things that belonged to him. I wrote it down. That first night, Ituha said, after he told it. That was over a week ago. Grier said, you've been carrying this a week. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't certain you would need it, she said. Now you might. He looked at the paper again. Then at her 19 years old, ribs still tender, and she had apparently spent a week making sure the truth couldn't disappear, along with everything else if the day went badly. If Cade finds this, he won't, Ituha said simply, because I have the original. This is a copy. There are 2 more, in 2 other places. I made certain none of them are anywhere a search would think to look. Grier had by this point stopped being surprised by her, had started, instead, simply being grateful. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, said Ituha, already moving toward the barn. They're 20 minutes out. The inspection lasted just under 2 hours, and every minute of it felt to Grier like walking across ice he could hear cracking somewhere just out of sight, and could do absolutely nothing about except keep walking, steady, like the sound wasn't there at all. Captain Silas Cade rode in at the head of the column, and Grier understood, the moment he saw him, exactly what Haskin had meant about the stillness. He sat his horse, the way a man sits a horse when he has trained himself, over years, to let nothing show, even careful eyes, a voice that gave away exactly as much as he intended it to, and not one word more. Mr. Calloway, Cade said, dismounting. We're conducting a survey of ranching operations in the region. Standard procedure, Grier said. Standard procedure. A pause, brief, almost nothing. We've had reports of displaced Apache in the area. Hostile elements. I've had cattle go missing myself, Grier said. Tracks suggest it wasn't Apache doing the taking. Found waxed twine at the trough, with a mercantile stamp on it, matter of fact. Something flickered behind Cade's eyes. Gone almost before it arrived, not quite surprise. Something closer to a man recalculating. A sum he thought was already settled. You read tracks, Mr. Calloway? I have people who do. Cade's gaze moved unhurried, across the yard to where a woman was mending tack near the barn, to where a man Grier didn't recognize. One of the newer arrivals was walking a horse in slow circles to cool it down. Cataloging. Filing. The same careful accounting Atua had clocked in Voss's hands weeks ago, except colder and backed by 50 riders instead of a smile. I'll need to walk the property, Cade said. You're welcome to, Grier said. It's a working ranch. There's not much to see. They walked, 2 hours of it the barn, which held horses and tack and nothing else, because Yen had made certain of it days ago. The cabin, which held furniture, supplies, and a couple who answered questions, in Spanish, with the patient, faintly weary tone of people who'd been stopped and questioned by armed men too many times in their lives to find it anything but tedious. Cade paused longest at the well, running one gloved hand along the stone rim, looking down into the dark water like he expected it to answer him directly. Quite a lot of ground for one man to work alone, he said. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation. Just a line dropped into the silence to see what came back out of it. Ranch this size, you learn to make do with what hands you've got, Grier said. Some of these folks needed work. I needed hands. Simple arithmetic. Simple, Katie repeated, like he was turning the word over to check its weight. He straightened, looked out toward the corral, toward the figures moving unhurried across the yard. Funny thing about arithmetic. Mr. Calloway. It rarely stays as simple as a man wants it to. He didn't wait for a response, just moved on toward the barn, and Grier fell into step beside him, heart going harder than his face was letting show, thinking about a hollow space beneath the very floorboards they were about to walk across, and an elderly couple lying still in the dark, not 4 feet beneath their boots. At one point, near the corral, one of the soldiers, young, freckled, clearly new enough to the work that he hadn't yet learned to hide his own nerves, as well as the men around him, paused near a stack of grain sacks and towed at something in the dirt with his boot. Grier felt his heart stop for the length of one full breath, watching until the young soldier simply moved on, whatever he'd nudged forgotten already, and Grier let the breath out slow through his nose and didn't let his face show a single thing. The yard held ranch hands doing ranch work, unhurried, unbothered, the way people look when they've genuinely got nothing to hide, which was, Grier understood, the single hardest thing Jan had asked any of them to perform in 3 weeks of asking hard things. The rocks held nothing. The creek bed held nothing. The cave held nothing, or at least nothing that showed itself to 50 men riding past on horses too large and too loud to move quietly through that particular stretch of ground. Cade walked it all with careful, intelligent eyes, and Grier walked beside him, and neither man spoke more than the situation required. The silence between them had the specific texture of two men who each suspected exactly what the other one knew, and had agreed for the moment to conduct the whole business through the surface of things instead of underneath it. The moment that mattered most came at the lean-to near the south wall. Haskon sat there on a low stool in the thin morning sun, mending a length of leather strap. He moved slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man his age and his dignity, and he did not look up when Cade approached. "Ask him how long he's worked here," Cade said to Grier. Grier opened his mouth. Haskon answered first, in Spanish, in a voice that carried the texture of someone who'd spoken it for 50 years on both sides of every border that had ever tried to divide this country, the kind of native fluency no learned performance could fake. He said he'd worked ranches across the territory for 32 years, said his back had seen better days and the coffee here worse, said the cattle looked thin but the water ran clean, which was the thing that mattered most. He said all of it without hurrying, without looking at Cade directly. Not from fear, from the particular choice of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 10 years, that certain people simply were not worth his full attention. Cade stood there, and something moved across his face, fast and controlled and gone almost before it started recognition, calculation, and then, for just a fraction of a second, something else entirely, something that looked to Grier, standing close enough to catch it, like the expression of a man coming face to face, without warning, with the reflection of his own actions, thrown back at him by the unbroken dignity of a person he had once tried and failed to break. He turned away. "We're done here," he said to his soldiers. Grier watched him go, watched him give the order to mount up, watched the 50 riders fall into line, watched Cade's back as he rode out of the yard without once looking behind him, and understood, with a certainty that settled into his chest like a stone dropping into still water, that Cade had recognized Haskon, had known him instantly, and had chosen not to say so. The column crossed back over the ridge and the sound of hoofbeats faded, and the ranch held itself absolutely perfectly still until the last of the dust had settled. Haskon found Grier before anyone else did, standing near the lean-to with his mending, set aside, his hands for the first time, since Grier had known him, not entirely steady. "He knew me," Haskon said, quietly. "The instant he looked at me, I saw it arrive behind his eyes the way a man sees weather arrive on a far ridge, no mistaking it for anything else. Once you have seen enough of it, you knew he would." "I hoped he would not have to," Haskon said. "There is a difference. I have carried his face in my memory for 10 years, without once wondering whether he carried mine in his. Today I have my answer." He was quiet a moment, looking out toward the ridge where the dust was still settling. "It changes something, Grier Calloway. I do not yet know what. A man who knows he has been recognized behaves differently than a man who believes his secret is still safely buried. We will need to watch now for which kind of man he intends to become. Dangerous kind or careful kind? That," Haskon said, "is the exact question, and I do not have an answer for you yet." Grier sat with it alone a while after Haskon moved off to help settle the camp back down. There was a part of him he wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't going to lie to himself about it either, that had wanted, In the moment, Cade turned his horse and rode away, something closer to satisfaction. A confrontation, a reckoning delivered right there in the dust of his own yard. Instead, there had only been that flicker across a careful man's face, gone almost before it arrived, and the slow, grinding understanding that whatever justice looked like here, it wasn't going to arrive today, in one clean motion, the way it did in the stories men told each other around a fire, to make the world feel more orderly than it actually was. He thought about Wren, about his mother and father, about whether the man who'd given the order for all of it had ever once, in 5 years, felt anything like the flicker Grier had just watched cross Cade's face. He didn't know, might never know, and he understood, sitting there in the settling dust, that not knowing was going to have to be something he learned to carry, the same way Hascon had carried a face without a name for 10 long years, and had somehow kept walking anyway. Then, from the cave system in the North Rocks, a voice rose in their own language, and another answered it, and somewhere in the exchange Grier heard something that might have been a laugh, low and disbelieving and entirely gloriously alive. People came out slowly at first, then all at once. The yard-filled elders emerging into the afternoon light with the particular careful joy of people testing whether the ground beneath them was still solid, the younger ones moving faster, checking each other over with quick hands and quicker eyes, making sure everyone who had gone into hiding had come back out of it whole. The elderly couple came up last from beneath the barn floor, the old man's hand shaking slightly as Grier helped him up into the light, and when the man's wife caught sight of the sky again, she made a small sound, not quite a sob, and pressed both hands briefly to her own face before she let anyone see the rest of it. Nayeli moved through the yard, checking on people with the same brisk, practiced care she gave the garden, pressing water into hands, murmuring low reassurances, and Grier watched her pause beside the young man who'd frozen up in that wash days back during the run from the canyon, and take his face gently between both her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes, saying something too quiet for Grier to catch. Whatever it was, the young man's shoulders came down an inch, and then another, and by the time she moved on to the next person, something in him had visibly loosened that had been wound tight since before he'd ever set foot on Grier's land. Tavik found the saddler first, pulled the old man into a rough, wordless embrace that lasted a long moment, and Grier, watching from the porch, understood that whatever quiet suspicion Tavik still carried toward him personally, there was no suspicion at all in the way this man held his own people, only the fierce, uncomplicated relief of someone counting heads and finding, against every reasonable expectation, that the number hadn't changed. Haskin simply stood in the middle of it all, turning slowly, taking in every face, and when his eyes found Grier's across the yard, he inclined his head once, not quite a bow, not quite a nod, something in between that Grier understood, without needing it explained, as its own kind of thank you, offered in a currency more valuable than words. Yen found Grier near the porch and stood beside him without speaking, watching the yard fill up the way it had been filling, slowly, for the better part of a month now. He knew Hascon, Grier said finally. I saw it too, Yen said. He didn't say anything. No. Grier turned to look at her. Why not? Yen was quiet a long moment, watching the yard, watching Ituha, weaving through the crowd, checking on people, watching Tavik standing near the corral with his arms crossed, and something on his face that, for the first time since Grier had met him, wasn't suspicion. Because, Yen said slowly, a man who has spent 10 years building a wall around a thing he did does not tear that wall down in front of 50 of his own soldiers. He protects it the same way he protects everything else he has built his life around. She looked at Grier, which tells us something important. What's that? That the wall is still standing, Yen said. Which means there is still something inside it he is afraid of losing. She held Grier's gaze, steady the same, steady she'd carried since the moment he'd unlocked the chains on her wrists a month ago, in a town neither of them had any reason to trust. A man like that can be reached, Grier Calloway. Not easily, not safely, but he can be reached. Behind them, the fire was being built back up for the evening, and someone had started singing, low, not performing it, just letting the sound exist the way the creek let its own sound exist, because the day was done, and everyone who had gone into hiding that morning had come back out whole, and singing, tonight was simply the thing to do. The evening settled into something Grier had come to recognize over the past weeks as the camp's particular rhythm. The fire built back up, Once, the day's fear had drained out of everyone's shoulders, food shared without much ceremony, and then, more often than not, someone would begin telling something. Not always a story in the sense Grier understood the word. Sometimes just an account of a day, offered aloud, or a memory of someone not present anymore, spoken into the fire like the fire itself might carry it somewhere useful. Tonight it was Nayeli who began, low and unhurried, a story about a spring that had once run dry for 3 full years in the country her grandmother had come from, and how the people there had learned to carry water great distances, rather than abandon the land that had raised them. Because the land, she said, remembers who stays. Grier sat at the edge of the circle, not fully inside it and not fully outside it either, and found that he didn't mind that particular, in-between kind of belonging nearly as much as he might have expected to, a month ago. Grier stood on his porch and watched his ranch, and now, somehow, 23 other people's only remaining piece of solid ground settled back into itself for the evening. And somewhere behind his ribs, in the same place $500 had come from a month ago, without asking his permission first, he felt something else start to take shape. Not a plan yet, not exactly, but the beginning of one, built out of a name Voss shouldn't have known to give away, and a face Kate had recognized and refused to name, and a notebook full of careful handwriting that a 19-year-old girl had been keeping since before anyone asked her to. 3 threads, pulling, he was starting to suspect, toward the same hand. He turned it over in his mind the way he'd turned the ring, once, without noticing he was doing it. A merchant who'd wanted this water since before Grier's father had even finished building the cabin they all slept in now. A captain who'd burned a village 10 years back and had just today chosen silence over exposure in front of his own men, which meant something in him still valued the silence more than the truth cost him to keep, and a girl not yet 20, who had quietly, methodically, over the course of a single month, assembled more of the actual shape of what was happening in this territory than anyone else Grier had ever met, armed with nothing but a notebook and an unwillingness to stop noticing things. He thought about his father, and the way the old man used to say that a ranch either grew roots or grew regrets, and that you could usually tell which one a man was cultivating by how carefully he watched his own water. He thought Voss had probably been watching this water for longer than Grier had been alive to notice him doing it. There was, underneath all of it, a clock now, and Grier could feel it ticking even if nobody had said the word out loud. A survey already underway on land that wasn't Voss's to survey. A captain who knew he'd been recognized and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. 23 people whose safety depended on how quickly the threads Grier had started pulling actually led somewhere solid enough to stand on. He didn't say any of that out loud. Not yet. The evening wasn't for it. The evening was for the sound of singing in the dark, and the sight of Hascon settling back onto his stool with the particular satisfaction of a man who had just stared down 50 soldiers without raising his voice once, and the small, steady presence of Yen beside him on the porch, watching the same fire, breathing the same air, both of them, for the first time in a long while, simply still. Later, when most of the camp had drifted to sleep and the fire had burned down to something low and steady, Grier found Yen still sitting on the porch step, looking out at the dark shapes of the buildings, the pale ribbon of the creek catching what starlight made it through the canyon walls. "You should be resting," he said, settling down near her, that same careful distance between them, though it felt tonight like it had shrunk by some small increment he couldn't quite measure. "I am resting," Yen said. "This is what resting looks like, for me. I have never learned to do it lying down with my eyes closed. Too many years of needing to hear things coming. Guess that makes 2 of us tonight." She looked at him sideways, something almost gentle in it. "You did well today, Grier Calloway. I want you to hear that plainly, because I do not think you will let yourself hear it any other way. 50 soldiers walked this land today, and every person who needed to stay hidden stayed hidden, and a great deal of that is because you built a life here worth trusting, before any of us ever arrived to test it. Didn't feel like doing much of anything. Felt like standing still and hoping. Standing still and hoping, done correctly, is very often the hardest work there is," Yen said. "I have done a great deal of both, in my life. I know the difference between a man who does it badly and a man who does it well." She was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "You did it well." He didn't have an answer for that either, not one that felt big enough for what she'd just handed him. So he said nothing, and let the silence sit between them, the way silence had started lately, to feel less like an absence and more like its own kind of company. Tomorrow, there would be threads to pull. Tonight, the water ran clear, and everyone who needed it to was still standing beside it. It would be Atuha, 3 days later, sitting on that same flat rock before dawn with her notebook and her charcoal, who finally found the thread that tied all three of them together, Voss, and the survey, and a name from 5 years back that nobody at that fire had thought yet to go looking for. But that discovery, and everything it set in motion, belonged to the next chapter of what this land was about to become. Tonight was only for the fire, and the singing, and the particular, hard-won peace of 23 people who had gone to sleep, for once, without needing to listen quite so hard for what might be coming. 3 days after the cavalry's inspection, Ituha found the name. She'd gone back into Marrow Creek twice more since the covert trip with Greer, always under some plain, ordinary cover supplies, a delivery, once actually riding along because a wagon needed a second pair of hands. She'd gone back to the bank clerk's assistant first, a young woman who found it useful, Ituha had learned, to talk while she swept the boardwalk, so long as nobody official-looking was standing close enough to overhear. Then to the feed store owner on the south end of town, 30 years in the same building, the kind of man who remembered every face that had ever passed through his door, because faces, to a man like that, were simply another kind of ledger. She hadn't asked either of them the same question twice. Hadn't let them know they were being asked anything at all, really. Just let them talk, the way people do when someone finally seems interested in what they know. It had taken her the better part of 2 weeks, working in careful pieces between chores and the ordinary business of the camp, never spending more than an hour in town at a stretch, never visiting the same person twice in the same week. She'd started keeping a second notebook by then, smaller, meant to be lost quickly if it ever needed to be, the real one kept elsewhere, in the place she still hadn't told even Greer the location of. He'd stopped asking. Understood by now that some caution wasn't distrust, was simply how a person who had survived what Ituha had survived stayed alive long enough to keep surviving. She brought the notebook to Greer at the corral, open to the last page, her handwriting tighter than usual, the way it went when she'd written something in a hurry because she hadn't wanted to trust it to memory even for the length of the ride home. His name was Emmett Slade, she said. He hired out as muscle across 3 counties, early on, left the territory not long after your family died. She turned the page. The feed store owner remembers him. Remembers who he drank with, the week before the attack on your ranch. Greer felt something go very still in his chest, the particular stillness that came right before a thing you'd been circling for a long time finally stopped moving and let you look at it directly. Who? He said. Ituha held out a second folded page. Garrison Voss, she said. He didn't move to take it right away. The bank clerk's assistant grew up hearing which names moved money in this town. Ituha went on, quiet, steady, the way she delivered everything that mattered most, and which names moved it quietly. She said Voss has moved money quietly for a long time. She said she always wondered why. 3 days before your family died, Voss paid Emmett Slade a sum large enough that the bank clerk at the time noted it in the margin of his ledger, not as anything improper, only as unusual. The ledger still exists. It is kept in the county archive, and it is a public record, which means it does not require anyone's permission to examine it. Greer took the paper. A name. An account. The careful, patient trail of a thing he had been carrying for 5 years, without ever knowing whose hand had put it there. He walked away from the corral a moment, needing, suddenly, more room than the yard could give him. Stood at the edge of the property looking north, toward nothing in particular, just open country, just sky. 5 years he'd woken some mornings and reached across an empty bed before his mind caught up to the day. 5 years he'd told himself a story about who had taken that bed's other half away from him, and had built, without meaning to, an entire architecture of grief around a villain, with no face, no name, nothing solid enough to actually be angry at, only mourned. Now the villain had a face, had shaken Greer's hand more than once, had stood in this very yard offering, with an easy smile, to buy the emptied-out remains of what his own greed had emptied. Greer stood there a long while, letting the anger arrive in full before he let himself walk back toward the fire, because he understood somewhere in his gut that whatever he did next needed to be done with a clear head, and a clear head required first letting the storm move all the way through, instead of standing in the middle of it pretending it wasn't there. Voss, with his warm smile, and his good horse, and his standing offer to buy the land, over and over, patient as weather. Voss, who had wanted the creek water for years, who had needed the family sitting on it gone, who had found a way to make that happen, and then waited for grief and debt to finish the rest of the work quietly on their own, and when grief and debt hadn't moved fast enough, had tried again. Different tools this time. A canyon location, sold to a captain with his own reasons to want Apache families found. A survey already underway on land that wasn't his. How certain are you, Greer asked. Certain enough to bring it to a federal judge, Itua said. Not certain enough to stand on it alone. She paused. But I am not alone, neither are you. Greer looked across the yard to where Tavik was working the horses with two of the other men, to where Haskon sat on his usual flat rock near the north wall, patient as the stone itself, to where Yen stood near the cabin, teaching one of the women how to cure meat the way her own mother had taught her. 23 people who had, over these last weeks, quietly and without asking anyone's permission, begun to make this yard their own. The federal circuit judge, he said, passes through Marrow Creek in 9 days, said Ituha. We need to present this properly, documented, with witnesses willing to stand up and say it out loud. Haskin will testify to the Slade connection if it's needed, and you, yes. He looked at her. Anyone else? Ituha followed his gaze to where it had already landed, without his quite meaning it to, on Tavik. And you, Greer said, looking back at her. Are you willing to stand up in that room, too? It's your notebook. Your work. Seems wrong for it to speak without you standing behind it. Something crossed Ituha's face. Quick, gone almost before he caught it. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated than fear. I have thought about that, she said. A great deal. She was quiet a moment, choosing her words the way she chose everything. Careful, deliberate. I am good at watching, at writing down what I see. I have never been asked to stand in a room full of strangers and be watched myself. I do not know if I am good at that. You don't have to be good at it. You just have to do it once. That is easy to say for a man who has never had strangers decide, first, before he opens his mouth, what kind of person he must be. She looked at him steadily, but yes, I will stand there. Not because it will be easy, because the work deserves someone willing to answer for it, and I have decided that person should be me, and not only Haskon, and not only Tavik. It is my notebook. You are right about that much. I didn't mean to push. You did not push, Ituha said. You asked. There is a difference, and I have noticed you are usually careful to keep it. A pause, and something almost gentle crept into her voice. That is one of the reasons I have decided to trust you, Greer Calloway, if you are curious. Not the auction. Not even the ribs. The asking, instead of the assuming. You have done a great deal of that these past weeks, without seeming to notice you were doing it. He didn't have a ready answer for that, so he just nodded, and let it sit between them, the way so much had learned, to sit between them lately without needing to be filled with more words than the moment could hold. That evening, before the conversation with Tavik, Greer walked out to the creek alone, the folded pages tucked inside his coat where the ring used to sit against his chest, and stood a long while at the water's edge, turning the whole shape of it over in his mind. 5 years he'd carried a story that had a face in it he'd never once questioned. Raiders. Strangers. An enemy with no name, because a name would have made the whole thing too specific to survive believing. And the truth, when it had finally arrived, hadn't come with a stranger's face at all. It had come with a name he'd shaken hands with. A man who'd stood in his own yard and offered, with a straight face and an easy smile, to buy the very land he'd emptied out to be sellable in the first place. There was something almost unbearably small about it once you saw it plain. Not a war. Not a cause. Just a man who wanted water badly enough to spend other people's lives to get it, and had very nearly gotten away with spending Greer's whole family in the bargain. He stood there until the light went, and then he went back to the fire, because there was a conversation waiting that he owed to a man who'd earned the right to hear it plainly, the same way Haskon had once earned the right to tell his own truth plainly, on this very ground in what already felt like a whole different life ago. The conversation with Tavik happened that same evening. Greer walked up to him directly. No easing into it. Just the facts, laid out plain the connection between Voss and the canyon leak, the bank account, Emmets, flight 5 years back, the fire that had taken everything Greer had. Tavik listened without interrupting. which was, Greer had learned by now, its own particular kind of discipline for a man built the way Tavik was built. When Greer finished, Tavik was quiet a long time. "This man," he said finally, "he had your family killed. To take your land. That's what the evidence says. And when you survived, and held on to it anyway," he waited. Tavik's jaw tightened, "and when that wasn't fast enough, he put my people in danger to put pressure on you." Yes, Tavik stood, walked a few steps from the fire, stood with his back to Greyer a moment. This was not a silence to rush, because that was the thing about Tavik. You didn't push him. Not because he was slow, because he was thorough, and thoroughness in a man his size sometimes looked, from the outside, like a very large person standing very still, while something enormous worked its way through him. He turned around. "I will testify," he said. "You don't have said I will testify." Flat, final. He looked at Greyer with those uncompromising eyes. "I will stand before your federal judge and say what I know. What was done to endanger my people by a man who had no right to make that choice for us." He paused. "I told you once that men like you choose yourselves when the pressure comes. I was wrong. The least I can do is stand up when standing up is required. You understand what it costs," Greer said. "An Apache man, testifying before a federal court in this territory." "I understand exactly what it costs," Tavik said. "I have already calculated it. A beat. Has it occurred to you that I am not only doing this for you? There are 23 people asleep in that barn tonight who should not have to keep running. There is an old man on that rock who has carried a face in his memory for 10 years and finally has somewhere to put it down." He held Greyer's gaze. "This is bigger than what you mean to me, Greyer Calloway. Do not make it small by making it only about that." Greyer nodded once. It was enough. Tavik looked at him a moment longer, then turned back to the fire. 5 days, he said. "Let's make sure everything is in order." The 5 days that followed took on a shape Greyer hadn't expected, and wouldn't have known how to plan for if he'd tried. It became, without anyone declaring it so, a task the whole camp took up together. Nayeli spent an evening helping Ituha organize the notebook's entries into something a stranger could follow without the context. Ituha carried in her own head dates lined up plain, names spelled the same way twice, nothing left to memory that could instead be left to ink. The saddler, whose steady hands had fixed every strap on the property, spent a full day crafting a small leather case to carry the documents in, unbidden, because, he said, a truth that important deserved better than a folded pocket. Koya asked, one evening, whether he could come along to town for the proceeding, just to stand in the back, just to see it happen. "I do not need to speak," he said. "I only want to see a man like that answer for something once in my life. I have never seen it happen before." "You can come," Greer told him. Even Haskon, who carried the heaviest part of the older story, and said the least about carrying it, spent an afternoon walking the fence line with Greyer, neither of them saying much, both of them simply working, the way two men sometimes need to work quietly beside each other before they're ready to say the harder things out loud. "There's one more thing," Tavik added, before Greer could turn away. "I owe you an acknowledgement, not tonight, maybe, but soon. I said things to you when we first met that I have not taken back yet, and I intend to." "No rush," Greer said. "There is always a rush with the truth," Tavik said. "That is the whole trouble with it. The longer you sit on it, the heavier it gets to carry." He didn't elaborate further, just nodded once and started to walk off toward the barn, then paused, glanced back. "You are better at this than I expected when I first rode in here and called you a man who chooses himself. I want that said plainly, once, so I do not have to keep saying it. High praise. Do not let it go to your head," Tavik said, with the ghost of something dry in it. "I have been wrong about people, exactly once. I intend to make it last a good long while before it happens again." "Fair enough." He walked off toward the barn, and Greyer watched him go, turning that particular piece of honesty over in his mind, the same way he'd been turning everything else lately, slow, careful, giving it the weight it deserved. It was Haskon who went to find Captain Cade alone, 3 days before the circuit judge was due. He didn't tell Greyer where, didn't tell Yen exactly when, simply saddled the paint horse one gray morning and rode out toward the crossroads, south of the ranch, the same unhurried way. He did everything like a man who had made peace a long time ago with the fact that some conversations could not be rushed toward without ruining them. He found Cade waiting, whether by message or by instinct. Greyer never learned and never asked. Haskon described it, later, only in the sparest of details, a crossroads with no shape to speak of. the sun already climbing hard by the time he arrived, and Cade sitting his horse the same way he'd sat it in Grier's yard. Still, careful, giving nothing away until he had decided precisely what he intended to give. "I have waited 10 years to say this to your face," Haskin told him, by his own account. "And now that the moment has arrived, I find I have less to say than I expected. Only this. I know what you did. I have known the shape of your face in firelight longer than some men know their own children's faces. And I am not here to threaten you, Captain. I am here to tell you that a choice is being made today, and it is mine to make, not yours, and I intend for you to understand exactly what it costs before I make it." Hascon told it to them himself that evening, sitting by the fire with his coffee going cold in his hands. The whole camp gathered close enough to hear, and quiet enough that even the creek seemed to lower its voice. "I told him what I saw," Hascon said. "The village. The fire in 3 places. His face in the light of it, and the way he turned his horse and rode away without expression, as if it cost him nothing at all. He turned the cup slowly. I told him I have carried it for 10 years, and that I could break him with it. That Tuha's document, combined with my own testimony before a federal court, would end his career. Possibly his freedom." Yen's hands had gone still in her lap. "And then Haskin said I told him I was not going to do it." The fire popped low. "Why?" Yen asked. Her voice had almost no sound behind it at all. "Because he does not deserve mercy," Haskin said simply. "Not particularly. But because there are 23 people on this land who need safety more than they need his ruin. And because the army does not mourn a captain. It replaces him." He looked around the circle of faces, gold in the firelight. A new man comes clean, untested. Without 10 years of guilt sitting behind his eyes, slowing his hand. Cade comes loaded. "And a loaded man moves carefully?" Greer asked. "Nothing for a long time," said Hascon. And then he asked what we wanted from him. He set his cup down. I told him, "Leave. Request a transfer. Go somewhere else. And live out whatever is left of his life, knowing that we chose not to break him and understanding exactly what that choice cost us to make. Let that understanding be the thing he carries out of this territory instead of a court order. That's not justice." Someone said quiet from the edge of the circle. One of the younger men, arms crossed, voice tight. Koya, Greer realized. Rope thrower, the one who still flinched, sometimes, at sudden movement near the tree line. No, Haskin agreed. It is not the kind of justice that feels like justice. It is the kind that keeps children who are not yet born from growing up in a world where their elders were killed for nothing, and their families spent everything they had chasing one man's punishment instead of building something that would outlast him. He looked around the fire again, slow, taking in every face. "I have thought about this for 10 years. I did not choose lightly, and I will tell you plainly, Koyo, because you deserve the plain truth as much as anyone here. There are nights. I am not certain I chose correctly. I have only chosen the thing I could live with carrying. That is not the same as certainty. It is the closest a man in my position ever gets to it." Koya held his gaze a long moment, then looked down at the fire, some of the tightness going out of his shoulders. Not agreement exactly, but something like trust, extended to a man who had earned the right to be trusted, even when his answer wasn't the satisfying one. Yen stood, walked a few steps away from the fire, stood with her back to all of them the way Tavik had, and Greer understood, watching her, that whatever she was holding right now was too large to let anyone see the shape of it moving through her. When she turned back, her face was composed, clear, present, except her eyes. "He agreed," she said, "not a question." "He agreed," said Hascon. "Men who understand calculation understand this one clearly enough, and the calculation was simple. A quiet transfer and a lifetime carrying what he knows we chose not to do to him. Or a public ruin and a replacement who owes us nothing and fears us even less." "I will speak with him myself," Yen said. "Tomorrow." Nobody argued with her. Grier understood, without being told, that this part, whatever it was going to be, belonged to her alone, and that his part was only to stand nearby and let that be enough. She didn't sleep that night, though she didn't say so, and Grier only knew it because he woke twice himself, well past midnight, and both times found the loft ladder's shadow still, and the small light of a single candle burning steady in the barn window. He didn't go up. Understood, the way he'd come to understand most things about her by now, that some vigils weren't meant to be shared, only respected from a careful distance. She told him, much later, long after everything else had settled, a little of what had kept her awake. Not that night specifically. Just the shape of it, offered once, unprompted, the way she offered most of what mattered to her. I had imagined that moment 100 times, she said, standing before the man who ordered my village burned. In every version, I said something different. Sometimes I wept. Sometimes I struck him. Once, in a dream I still remember clearly, I said nothing at all, only looked at him until he could not bear the weight of being looked at and rode away on his own, without my needing to say a single word. She was quiet a moment. None of my imagined versions matched what actually happened. I have decided that is simply how truth behaves. It rarely arrives in the shape you rehearsed for it. Hascon sought Grier out later that night, after most of the fire had gone quiet, found him checking the horses one last time before turning in. "You are wondering if I made the right choice," Hascon said. "Not a question. Wasn't going to ask. You did not need to. I have watched you not ask a great many things these past weeks. It is one of your better qualities." The old man leaned against the corral rail beside him, looking out at the dark shapes of the horses. "I will tell you what I would not say by the fire, in front of the others, because they need to believe their leader chose with a steady hand, and mostly I did. But I will tell you quietly, here some nights I still see his face in the firelight. Still, after everything. And on those nights, the choice does not feel steady at all. It feels like a debt I have decided to carry so that 23 other people do not have to carry it instead. That's a heavy thing to volunteer for." "It is the heaviest thing I have ever volunteered for," Haskin agreed. "But I am an old man, Grier Calloway, and old men are better built for carrying heavy things than the young are. That is perhaps the one genuine use an old man still has in this world. I intend to make good use of it, for however many years I have left to be useful at all." She met Cade at the crossroads the next morning. Grier didn't go. Haskin had been clear about that, in his quiet way, and Grier had learned over these last weeks that some doors were not his to walk through. He worked instead, fed the horses, checked the cattle, talked with one of the younger men about a support beam on the lean-to that had started to work loose. Didn't look at the road south more than once every 10 minutes, which was, he was fairly sure, essentially looking at it the whole time. Yen came back 2 hours later, walked past him without stopping, straight into the cabin. He heard water being poured, the particular quiet of someone who needed a moment alone, and was taking it. He waited 20 minutes. She came back out, stood on the porch. "He'll request a transfer by the end of the week," she said. "He won't send patrols to this property again before he leaves. And he will not pass this ranch's location to whoever replaces him, not as a point of interest, not as anything." "What did you say to him?" She looked out at the yard, at the people moving through it, safe, for now, in a way none of them had been safe in months. "I put a Tua's document on the ground between us," she said. "Let him read every word of it." Then I looked at him a long time without saying anything at all. She paused. "And then I told him, I know what you did. You know that I know. And I am choosing to walk away from this crossroads with my people still breathing. That is what I am trading for your silence. Do not mistake it for forgiveness. Mistake it for weakness." And then I stood up and walked back to my horse. Did he a long pause. He said he was sorry. "Did you believe him?" "I believe he meant it," Yen said slowly. "In that moment. Whether he means it a year from now, that is a question I cannot answer, and I have decided to stop trying to answer it." She turned to look at Grier directly. "What I can answer is this. My people are alive. My sister's ribs have healed. Haskin is sitting on his rock in the sun, and we are standing on land with clean water, and a roof, and work." She held his gaze. "That is not everything." "No," Grier said. "It is not nothing." They stood there a while, on the porch, in the morning light, not saying anything else, because some things simply did not require it. The night before the party left for Marrow Creek, the whole camp gathered around the fire longer than usual, nobody quite ready to call the evening finished. Nayeli told a story that ran long, about a hard winter her grandmother had survived through sheer stubborn refusal to stop believing spring was coming, and by the time she finished, half the circle had drifted into a comfortable, companionable quiet that felt, to Grier, like its own kind of preparation, not for a fight, exactly, but for whatever the next day would ask of them. Hascon spoke last, brief, unhurried as ever. "Tomorrow we ask a stranger in a black coat to say out loud, in a room full of people who have never had to believe us before, that what happened to us was real, and was wrong, and had a name attached to it." He looked around the circle. We have already survived worse than a courtroom. I want every one of you to remember that. Tomorrow, if your courage falters even slightly, you have already survived worse than this. Nobody said anything after that. Hadn't needed to. The fire simply burned on a while longer, and one by one people drifted off toward sleep, until only Greer Yan remained, watching the coals, saying little, because by then there was nothing left that needed saying that the morning wouldn't say better. 2 days later, the whole camp turned out to see the small party off for Marrow Creek Greer, Haskin, Tavik, Ituha, with the leather case held against her chest like it weighed considerably more than paper and ink actually did. Nayeli pressed a wrapped bundle of food into Greer's hands that none of them would need until well past the Traktatal end, the gesture itself mattering more than the practicality of it. Yen checked the wagon's harness twice, though it had been checked and rechecked the night before, her hands needing something useful to do, while the rest of her stayed carefully, deliberately calm. "You'll do fine," Greer told Ituha as they climbed up. "I know that I will," she said, in a tone that suggested she'd already settled the question for herself some days back and found his reassurance, while appreciated, entirely unnecessary. "I am not frightened of failing today, Greer Calloway. I am only frightened of how it will feel afterward, whichever way it goes." She looked at him. "That is a different kind of fear. I have not decided yet whether it is a worse one." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he simply nodded and clicked the horses forward, and the ranch fell away behind them the way it always did, familiar and steady, waiting the way it had learned to wait for whatever came back to it by evening. The federal circuit judge was a man named Everett Holloway. He had ridden the same circuit for 19 years, arrived on schedule, left on schedule, and carried the particular quality of attention that men develop after 2 decades of listening to people lie to him professionally, and learning, slowly, to hear the difference between that and the truth. Marrow Creek's land office meeting room had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered the morning Holloway set up his docket. Word traveled fast in a town that size, and by the time the doors opened, the benches were near full ranchers who'd known Greer's father, a handful of women from town whose faces Greer half recognized from years of nodding acquaintance at the mercantile. Ezra Dunmore near the back with his hat in his hands and an expression Greer couldn't quite read. Not everyone in that room was friendly, but everyone in that room was watching, and Greer understood, taking his seat, that whatever happened here today was going to become the story this town told about itself for a long while afterward. Holloway sat up in the land office meeting room, opened his docket and began. Greer was called to speak first. He stood where he was told to stand, and when Holloway asked him to describe the events of 5 years past, he found the words came slower than he'd braced himself for, each one costing more than he'd expected it to. "I sold 3 head at market that day," he said. "Rode back in the late afternoon. Saw smoke from 3 miles out, and knew, before I ever reached the gate, that whatever waited for me there was going to change the rest of my life." He paused, steadied himself. "My father and mother were in the main cabin. My sister was in the barn. I buried all 3 within the week, on land my father chose because the water ran clear here, and I carried the story I was given about, who did it for 5 years. Because grief doesn't leave a man much room to ask better questions than the ones he's handed." Greer laid out the case against Voss first to his documentation, the bank records connecting him to Emmett Slade, the timeline running from Voss's mercantile visit straight through to Cade's knowledge of the canyon location. His voice shook once, reading the date of his family's death aloud in a room full of strangers, and he stopped, took a breath, and kept going, because Ituha had taught him, without ever quite saying so, that the shaking didn't need to stop the words. It only needed to not stop them for long. Hascon testified next, in Spanish, then in English, both equally precise, describing the attack on Greer's ranch 5 years before, what he'd since learned about how hired raiders moved through this territory versus how Apache raiding parties actually operated, and the pattern connecting the two. He spoke, too, of the village burned 10 years past, though he did not, on Ituha's careful advice, name the officer aloud in open court that thread they had agreed could wait, could be handled elsewhere, in the quieter accounting. Haskin and Yen had already settled with Cade directly. Today was for Voss. Ituha had testified before Tavik, her voice steady, despite what she'd admitted to Greer days before, laying out the timeline of her entries with the same careful, unhurried precision she brought to everything, answering Holloway's questions plainly, without embellishment, without once looking toward Voss's side of the room to see how her words were landing. When she finished, Holloway looked at her a long moment over his papers. "Miss Ituha," he said, "in 19 years on this circuit, I have rarely seen documentation this thorough from a trained clerk, let alone from someone working entirely on their own initiative. Whatever else comes of today's proceeding, I want it on the record that this court recognizes the quality of the work before it." Something moved across Itua's face then, brief, almost too quick to catch, not quite surprise. Something closer to a wall settling half an inch, just enough to let a little more light through than usual. She said nothing in response beyond a quiet thank you. But Greer, watching from the back of the room, understood he'd just witnessed something rare, a moment when the world, for once, had looked directly at the size of what she carried and named it correctly. And then Tavik walked in. Greer hadn't known exactly when he would arrive. Hadn't asked. Tavik was going to do this, or he wasn't, and pushing would have broken something that mattered more than the schedule. He walked in, sat down across from Judge Holloway, the largest person in the room by a considerable margin, and the straightest, stated his name, his relation to the people living now on the Callaway Ranch, and then, clearly without embellishment, everything he knew: the supply run, the canyon location, the patrol position days before anyone should have known where to position it. The room stayed very quiet while he spoke. Greer sat in the back and did not let himself feel his eyes sting. That was a private matter, between himself and whatever was gathering there, and it did not need to enter the public record. But Tavik, who had walked into this yard weeks ago and said, "I don't trust you," who had said, "Men like you choose yourselves when the pressure comes," who had been wrong and admitted it, and then done, this Greer understood, watching him, that 3 words were not adequate. Nothing was adequate. But sometimes the only thing a man had to offer was the witnessing itself. "I was here, I saw this. This is true," and sometimes that was the exact thing that held a community together, not the grand gesture. This. Judge Holloway thanked him, then turned to Garrison Voss. Voss had sat through all of it, had come in clearly expecting a different kind of proceeding, the kind where he was the aggrieved party, holding the complaint instead of answering to one. He'd filed his own papers ahead of time. A distressed property inquiry, a complaint accusing Greer of harboring fugitives. He had expected to walk in and let those papers do the work for him. Instead, he had watched the room fill with something else entirely. By the time Tavik finished, the ease Voss had walked in wearing had gone somewhere quiet and thin. The smile was still there on the surface, but underneath it, something had shifted, like a building whose foundation has just been questioned and is now checking, silently, whether it can still bear the weight it's carrying. Greer watched him glance once, briefly, toward the back of the room, toward Ezra Dunmore and the other ranchers who'd known him 20 years as a friendly, dependable man, and saw something close to genuine alarm cross his face, for the very first time, not at the evidence, but at the audience. Voss's man, a lean, sharp-featured attorney he'd apparently sent for from the county seat the moment word of the proceeding reached him, arrived just as Tavik was finishing, and made a hurried attempt to object to the timeline of documents, to the chain of custody on Ituha's notebook, to the reliability of testimony given by, as he put it, parties with an obvious personal stake in the outcome. Judge Holloway heard him out, patient, unhurried, the way he'd clearly heard out a great many objections over 19 years on this circuit. "Counselor," Holloway said, when the man finished, "every witness in every case I have ever heard has a personal stake in the outcome. That is, generally speaking, why they are testifying." A ripple, up, of something that might have been suppressed laughter moved through the benches. "As to the notebook, miss," he glanced at his notes, "Ituha has kept a dated, corroborated record, cross-referenced against public bank filings and independent testimony from 3 separate individuals in this town. I have seen considerably less rigorous documentation, used to convict men of considerably lesser crimes. Your objection is noted. It does not move me." The attorney sat back down. Voss's jaw tightened, and for the first time all morning, Greer saw something in his face that looked less like a man managing a difficult situation and more like a man watching the floor give way beneath him, one board at a time. Judge Holloway looked at Voss a long moment. "Mr. Voss," he said, "you have heard the testimony. The documentation before me includes bank records, witness accounts, and a pattern of transactions suggesting material involvement in both the attack on the Callaway property 5 years ago and the recent disclosure of protected refugee locations to military personnel. He set the papers down. "Do you wish to respond?" Voss's smile made one last appearance. Thinner now, more effortful. "Judge," he said, "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding." "I'm not asking for your interpretation," Holloway said. "I'm asking whether you have responsive evidence. Documents, witnesses, anything that contradicts what I have just heard." Silence. The particular, heavy silence of a man who had spent years operating on the quiet assumption that a certain kind of person, the kind sitting across the room from him now, would never be believed when they spoke, would never be taken seriously when they documented, would never appear before a federal judge with organized, corroborated evidence, and a witness willing to stand up in a room full of strangers and say it out loud. He had miscalculated fundamentally and completely. "No," Voss said finally. "I don't have responsive evidence." A murmur moved through the benches, low, quickly hushed. Ezra Dunmore's hat, Grier noticed, had gone very still in his hands. Judge Holloway wrote something down. "Then I suggest," he said, in the particular tone of a judge making a suggestion that was not, in fact, optional, "that you make yourself available for the full proceeding when I return through this circuit next month, at which point you will want counsel, and considerably more than what you've offered today." He looked over his papers. "And Mr. Voss, if this property changes hands, or is damaged, or if any of the individuals who testified here today come to harm before that proceeding, I will treat it as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Do you understand me clearly?" "Yes," said Voss. And for the first time since Grier had known him, he looked exactly like what he actually was. A man who had built an empire out of other people's losses, on the quiet assumption that those losses were too scattered and those people too easily dismissed to ever add up to anything in a room like this one. They had added up. The gavel came down. Not a conviction that would take another month, another proceeding, the slow machinery of the law turning over the way it turned over everything, patient and unglamorous. But the shape of Voss's future had changed in that room on that afternoon, and everyone present could see it. Even him. Especially him. Outside on the boardwalk. Afterward, Ezra Dunmore caught up to Grier before he'd reached the wagon, hat still in his hands, something working in his face that looked, this time, less like judgment, and more like a man revisiting an old certainty and finding it considerably less solid than he'd believed. "I owe you an apology," Dunmore said, "for the auction. What I said to you. You said it out of concern. I understood that then." "Doesn't make it right," Dunmore said. "I've known Garrison Voss 20 years. Thought I knew him anyhow." He shook his head slowly. "Man sat at my table more times than I can count. Never once saw a thing in him that looked like what I heard in that room today." He held out his hand, and Grier took it. "Your father would have been proud of what you did out there, son. I mean that plainly. I don't say it lightly." Grier didn't have an answer for that either, not one that felt big enough, so he just nodded, and let the handshake say the rest of it. Koya found him a moment later, having hung back near the doorway the whole proceeding, quiet the way he still often was. His eyes were red-rimmed, though he made no attempt to hide it. "I did not think I would see it," he said. A man like that made to answer, in a room full of people who believed him respectable only that morning. He shook his head slowly. "I have watched my whole life pass through rooms where the answering only ever went one direction. I did not know what it would feel like the other way." "How's it feel?" Koya considered the question with real weight the way he considered most things now. "Smaller than I expected," he said finally, "and larger, both at once. I do not think I have the words for it yet. Perhaps I never will. Perhaps it does not need words." He looked at Grier a long moment. "Thank you for letting me stand in the back and see it." "Wasn't mine to give or withhold," Grier said. "You earned your place in that room the same as anyone." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon. Grier, Yen, Haskon on his paint horse, Tavik trailing slightly behind, quiet, the way a man is quiet after he's finally set something down he's been carrying a long time. Nobody said much. The land moved past on either side the way it always did. Red rock, scrub, brush, the smell of dry earth and sage, the day already easing toward evening cool. Grier held the reins and kept turning it all over in his mind. Tavik, standing in that room and saying it out loud, Dunmore's hand, and the plain weight of what he'd said. The look on Holloway's face reading Ituha's documents, not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition. the look of a man encountering rigorous, careful work and responding to it on its own terms. Ituha had made them impossible to dismiss. That was, Greer thought, maybe the most important thing anyone had done in this entire long chain of events. He was fairly certain she'd explain that to him at length if he tried to thank her for it. So he said nothing, just rode. The ranch came into view around the last bend, and the yard was full, the way it had been full for weeks now. People moving between the buildings in the blue evening light, the fire already going at the center, someone singing near the barn, not performing it, just letting the sound exist because the evening was cool and the day was done and singing was, simply, the thing to do. Haskon rode in first. One of the women ran to his horse, said something that made him laugh, low and easy. Tavik had dismounted at last, stood in the middle of the yard a moment, looking at all of it. Yen walked over, put a hand briefly on his arm, said something quiet in their own language. He looked at her a long moment, said something back, just a few words. She nodded. Greer didn't ask what had passed between them. It wasn't his to know. Then Tavik picked up a fence tool, leaning against the post, and went to look at a stretch of fencing along the south wall that had been needing attention because the work continued. Because that was what building something actually looked like, not the dramatic moment, which passes, but the ordinary morning after it, when you get up and check the fence and keep going. In the weeks that followed, before that second proceeding on Voss's fate ever arrived, the shape of things at the ranch began slowly to change in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms at all. Nayeli's garden, thriving now well past what the plot had ever produced under Grier's own hand, started yielding enough that she began teaching two of the younger women to preserve the surplus for the coming winter, jars lining the pantry shelves in neat, careful rows. The saddler took on an apprentice from among the younger men, patient and exacting, passing along a trade that would, Grier understood without either of them saying so, outlast whatever temporary arrangement had first brought them all together under this roof. Koya's rope work had gotten good enough that Grier caught himself more than once, simply watching him work a young horse in the corral, with an ease that made the whole exercise look like something closer to conversation than training. It wasn't a plan, any of it. Nobody had sat down and decided this was what the ranch would become. It had simply happened, the way water finds the low ground, the way 23 people, with nowhere else safe to stand, had slowly, without much ceremony, turned a place into something worth calling home, for as long as home was needed, and maybe though nobody said this part aloud yet, not even to themselves for longer than that. The elderly couple with the lame horse were the first to speak of moving on, gently, without any hint of ingratitude in it. They'd found a small parcel 2 valleys over, they told Grier one evening, land with its own spring, cheap enough that what little they'd managed to save over a lifetime might actually stretch to cover it, now that the cavalry no longer had reason to hunt down every family bearing their particular history. The old man asked Grier, almost shy about it, whether he'd be willing to put in a word with the land office on their behalf, since a friendly rancher's name attached to a filing carried weight that theirs alone still did not. "Course I will," Grier said. "Proud to. You have given us more than shelter," the old woman told him, taking his hand in both of hers, weathered and steady. "You have given us the chance to want something again, instead of only surviving. I did not know, until these last weeks, how much I had stopped letting myself want anything at all." Grier thought about that long after they'd walked back toward the fire, and understood it as maybe the truest measure of what this whole strange, unplanned undertaking had actually been, for not simply keeping people safe, though that had mattered plenty, but handing them back enough steadiness that wanting things again became possible. A future, a parcel of land with its own spring. Small, ordinary hopes that had been, for months, an unaffordable luxury. But that evening, the evening of the trial itself, none of that had settled in yet. That evening was still only for the fire, and the singing, and the particular, fragile relief of a day that had gone better than any of them, had truly dared to hope. Grier sat on the porch step the way he had that very first evening 2 months ago now, except the yard in front of him was a different yard entirely. Fuller. More complicated. More alive. Yen came and sat beside him, not standing this time, but settling down onto the step itself close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, without either of them needing to remark on it. "Cade's transfer came through," she said. "Haskin had word this morning before we left for town. He actually did it. He actually did it. A pause. Haskon said he looked like a man who had been holding his breath for 10 years and had finally, for reasons he couldn't fully explain to himself, been allowed to let it out. Grier sat with that. Is that enough? He asked. No, Yen said. But it is what we have. And it is real. She looked out at the yard at Haskon settling onto his usual rock, at Tavik already elbow-deep in fence work, at Ituha sitting with two of the older women near the fire, talking easy now, the way people talk when they've earned the right to rest. I have learned not to refuse what is real, simply because it is not everything. He looked at her. This is not what I imagined, she said quietly, that first night. When you told us about a roof and food and work and made it sound like the smallest thing in the world. What did you imagine? I don't know, something smaller, quieter, fewer people, and less broken fence. He almost laughed. Worse or better than you imagined? She looked at him a long moment. The same steady, reading look she'd given him at the auction 2 months back. Still finding things, still filing them away. Not worse, she said. Just larger than I expected. Which, I am learning, is not the same thing as worse at all. The fire burned low behind them as the evening deepened, the singing fading into low, easy conversation, and one by one the camp settled towards sleep. Grier and Yen stayed where they were, on the step, neither of them in any particular hurry to move, and somewhere in the slow passing of that hour the conversation wound its way, without either of them quite steering it there, from Cade's transfer, to the trial, to something quieter and further back. Do you know where the ring is now? Yen asked, at one point, gently, like she'd been waiting a long while for the right moment to ask it. The one you sold. He hadn't expected the question. Sat with it a moment before answering. Pawnbroker's window, most likely. Or sold on by now to someone else's hand. He turned his bare hand over once, looking at the pale, faint mark still visible where the ring had sat for years. Didn't think I'd stop noticing it was gone. Some mornings I still reach for it before I remember. Do you regret it? No, Grier said, surprised at how quickly and how completely the answer arrived. Once he actually let himself consider it, the ring was only ever a piece of metal. What it meant that never lived in the silver. That's still here, same as it always was. He looked at her. Addie would have understood exactly what I traded it for. I think she'd have called it a fair trade too, if she'd had the chance to weigh in. You speak of her gently. She deserves gentle. He was quiet a moment, watching the last of the fire. 5 years. And some days it still catches me sideways. Not the grief so much anymore. More the ordinary things. She used to hum while she worked. Same as your mother, it sounds like. I still catch myself listening for it, some mornings, before I remember. And your sister. Wren wanted to see the ocean, Grier said. Never got the chance. I used to think that was the saddest part of losing her, all the things she never got to do. Took me a long while to understand the sadder part was simpler than that. Just that she isn't here anymore to want anything at all. He looked over at Yen. You'd have liked her. She didn't suffer for fools. Neither do you, from what I've gathered. A fair assessment, Yen said, and something in her voice, gentle, almost teasing, was new enough that Grier felt it land somewhere warm behind his ribs. Yen was quiet a moment, watching the last of the fire. My mother used to say something similar, she said, that the things worth keeping are rarely the things you can hold in your hand. She meant it about the songs, mostly the ones she sang while she worked. But I think it was true of more than songs. They sat there together as the last of the light went out of the sky, and full dark settled over the canyon walls, stars arriving one at a time the way they always did, patient, unhurried, indifferent to how long it had taken the two people below them to reach this particular quiet. From inside the barn up in the loft, Grier could hear the low murmur of voices, then quiet, then one voice, soft, telling something to someone, the cadence of a story, rising and falling the way water moves over stone at different depths. Nayeli again, probably, or one of the elders, offering up some piece of memory to the dark the way they did most nights now, a habit that had become, without anyone deciding it formally, simply part of how this ranch ended its days. He sat and listened to the shape of it without understanding the words, and thought that this actually was the thing. Not the trial, not the confrontation with Cade, not even the auction 2 months back that had started all of it. This. A voice in the dark, still telling its story, still refusing to stop telling it. She's telling the story of the first people, Yen said quietly, after a while, following his gaze toward the barn. How they came to this land. What they were told to remember. What were they told to remember? Yen was quiet a moment. That the land is not owned, she said. That people only pass through it. What matters is what you leave behind in it. Whether you left it better, she paused. Whether the water still ran clear after you. Grier looked out at the dark yard, at the coals of the fire, at the shapes of buildings his father had raised with his own hands on land he'd chosen for one reason only. He thought about his father, choosing this land for the water. His mother teaching him to wrap ribs by lamplight in this same kitchen, years before either of them could have imagined why he'd need to know it. His sister, Wren, standing in front of him with her arms out, the way she always had, right up until the day she couldn't anymore. He thought about all of it, without the old scaffolding, holding it up the wrong story he'd carried for 5 years, the one that said his family's killers were the very people who had ended up saving what was left of him. The truth had turned out to be smaller than that story, and somehow more terrible for it. A man who wanted water, and found a way to take it. Small, specific, ordinary almost in its greed set against a loss that would never once feel small. But the truth had also been the thing that opened a door. People do not attack from arroyos at that hour. A single sentence, spoken plainly by a woman who owed him nothing, on a night she had every reason to say nothing at all. And from that one sentence, everything else had unspooled this yard, these people, this complicated alive, entirely unplanned thing he had somehow built, without ever once sitting down to design it. I think it does, Grier said finally, answering her question about the water, though enough time had passed between her asking and his answering, that another man might have thought the conversation had already moved on without him. The water runs clear. Yen looked at him. Yes, she said. It does. They sat there together a while longer, the fire down to almost nothing, the voice from the barn loft still moving through its story, the creek somewhere out in the dark doing what it had always done, indifferent and constant and clean, and Greer Calloway who had ridden into Marrow Creek one ordinary morning, with 3 simple things on his mind, and a debt he thought he understood, and had come home instead, with something he was only now beginning to find the words for sat, on the porch step of his father's ranch, in the company of people he hadn't had a place for in his life 2 months earlier and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the specific, quiet shape of a future, not a plan, not a certainty, just a future, open ahead of him. Clear, the way the water in the creek was clear and had always been, waiting patiently for someone to finally notice. He thought he might say something to Yen about it, right there on the step, while the fire still had a little warmth left in it. Not everything, just something, a beginning, which was, he was starting to understand how every true thing in his life had ever actually started, not with arrival, with the first step toward. The first snow came late that year, dusting the canyon walls sometime past the middle of November, and Grier woke to find the yard gone quiet and white and strangely peaceful, smoke rising steady from 3 separate chimneys now, instead of one the cabin, the reinforced lean-to that had become, over the months, less a temporary shelter and more a small house in its right, and the barn, where a proper stove had gone in sometime in October at Tavik's insistence, on the grounds that a man could tolerate a great many hardships, but a cold loft in winter was not among the ones he intended to tolerate twice. Most of the 23 were still there, though not all. The elderly couple had taken their parcel 2 valleys over that autumn, and rode back every few weeks with news and, more often than not, a jar of something the old woman had put up, refusing gently but absolutely to let the debt of gratitude run only in one direction. 2 of the younger families had moved on toward relatives further north, once the roads opened safely enough to travel, and Koya had gone with them for a time before writing, in careful, improving English, to say he'd found steady work with a horse breeder 2 counties over, and to ask almost shyly whether Greer might vouch for his character if the position required references, which Greer had done gladly, and at some length. But most had stayed. Nayeli's garden, dormant now under the snow, would come back in spring the way gardens do, and Greer had already caught himself, more than once, planning next year's planting rotation in his head, like a man who fully expected to still be standing in this yard to see it through. The saddler's apprentice had gotten good enough to take on small repair jobs from neighboring ranches, bringing in coin that went, without much discussion, into a shared account Yen kept, with the same careful precision she brought to everything else she touched. Haskon still sat on his rock most mornings, though he'd taken lately to bringing a blanket against the cold, and Greer had built him a proper bench the week before, low enough for old knees, angled just right to catch the first sun over the eastern ridge. The old man hadn't said much about it, had only run one weathered hand along the wood, nodded once, and sat down like the bench had always been there waiting for him, which Greer privately thought it more or less had. Voss's second proceeding had come and gone by then. The outcome exactly what the shape of that first afternoon had promised. The mercantile sold off in pieces to settle what the court determined he owed. The man himself gone from the territory entirely, last anyone heard, to somewhere further east, where his name didn't yet carry the particular weight it had earned itself in Marrow Creek. Cade's transfer had come through cleanly, quietly. No further patrols, no further visits. The wall Hascon had spoken of still standing, as far as anyone could tell, though what lived behind it now was, by design, no longer any of their concern to guess at. Greer stood at the window that first snowy morning, watching Yen cross the yard toward the barn, her breath showing white in the cold air, moving with that same fluid, unhurried certainty she'd carried since the very first morning she'd come down the ladder with her hair braided, and her marks freshly drawn, and understood, watching her, that some questions a man doesn't need to rush toward answering, that some beginnings are allowed to simply keep beginning, morning after morning, for as long as both people involved are willing to keep showing up for them. He pulled his coat on and went out to meet her, because that, more than any single grand gesture he could have planned, was the truest shape the last 6 months had taught him love could take. Ordinary mornings, chosen over and over on purpose. The water ran clear under the ice that winter, the way it always had, the way Yen's people had always said it would if a man left the land better than he found it. Greer Calloway had done that, without ever once setting out to. He understood that now, standing in the cold with his breath rising white to meet hers, watching the sun come up gold over land his father had chosen for exactly one reason. All those years before either of them had known what it would someday hold.